Karen stood in the rain, looking at the house his grandfather had left him. The house was smaller than a miller's shed. 4 bare walls of gray stone, a single door made of black wood, not a single window. The notary read the document aloud and said that old Odwin had bequeathed to his grandson a shack on Cole Street and a brass key, nothing else. A crowd of onlookers at the gate laughed. The scrap dealer Falco told the neighbors that the late had managed to mock his dim-witted grandson even after death. Karen was 19 years old. For 3 years, he'd been hauling sacks at the port of Grimward and sleeping in a flophouse for 2 skilling. His parents had died during the plague year. His grandfather hadn't spoken to him while he was alive. The city had been starving for 2 seasons. The war in the south had devoured both the harvest and the men. A pound of flour cost 8 skilling. Last year, it had cost 2. The notary added that the house was subject to a tax on shelter, 40 skilling a month. The first payment was due in 12 days. Those who failed to pay were sent to drain the marshes. Only 1 in 3 returned from the marshes. Karen had 11 skilling in his pocket. Falco stepped closer and offered a deal. He said he'd buy that stone box for 200 skilling right then and there. He said he was doing it out of pity. He said the stone would be used for backfill and that the land under the house was worth less than dirt. The onlookers nodded. Everyone knew that Falco had already bought up 6 houses on this street for a song. Karen looked at the wall of the house. Then he did something no one expected. He ran his hand over the masonry and said the stone wasn't local. He said it was smoky granite from the northern ridge. He said a single block like that weighed more than 300 pounds, and that shipping a single block cost more than what Falco was offering for the entire house. He said there were 240 such blocks in the wall. Falco opened his mouth and shut it again. The dock worker had been unloading stone from northern barges for 3 years and knew the value of every type of rock by touch. No one in the crowd knew that. The onlookers fell silent. Falco squeezed out that 200 skilling was his final offer, and that in 12 days the pup would come crawling over on its own. Karen took the key and went inside. The door closed behind him, cutting off the laughter from the street. Inside was a single room, 6 by 6 paces, a hearth without firewood, a plank bed, a table, and 3 interior doors in the back wall. Karen opened the first one. Behind it was a storage closet an elbow's depth, empty. Behind the second door was another storage niche just as deep. Behind the third was a storage niche slightly deeper, also empty. 3 doors leading nowhere. The old man had built a house with 3 doors set into stone niches. Karen sat down on the plank bed and counted again. 11 skilling. He needed 40. The port paid the stevedore 3 skilling a day, and the work was every other day. Even if he didn't eat at all, he'd have 21 skilling by the deadline. He lay down and began to think about the marshes. A sound woke him, a soft click, as if a lock had been turned. Karen opened his eyes in total darkness. Light was coming through a crack under the third door, a warm, even light, in a house with no windows and no fire. He stood up and picked up a splinter of wood from the floor. His heart was pounding against his ribs. He pulled the door toward him. Behind the door was not a pantry. Behind the door was a storeroom, a long room about 20 paces long that could no way fit inside a 6 by 6 house. Shelving ran along the walls. On the shelves lay sacks of grain, wheels of cheese wrapped in wax, bundles of dried fish, a barrel of oil, a crate of dried apples. Karen stood in the doorway, holding his breath. He had grown up in the port and knew the value of things. There was 800 skillings worth of food on those shelves. He remembered he hadn't eaten since morning. He stepped inside. The floor was warm. The air smelled of grain and smoke. He cut open a wheel of cheese and ate standing up until his stomach ached. Then he began hauling things. He carried 4 sacks of grain into the living room, 6 wheels of cheese, all the fish. He worked until his back ached, stacking the food by the hearth. He counted aloud. 1 sack of grain was worth 60 skilling at Falco's. The market was closed for months to come. He laughed to himself in the stone house and couldn't stop. Toward morning, he fell asleep right on top of the sacks. He woke up from the cold. Gray light seeped through a crack under the front door. Dawn. Karen was lying on the bare floor. The sacks were gone. The cheese was gone. There was no fish. He jumped up and flung open the 3rd door. Behind it was an empty storage room 2 cubits deep, a stone niche. He felt along the back wall, solid, cold granite. He turned the whole room upside down. All the food had vanished, down to the last crumb. All that remained was the satisfying warmth in his stomach. So it wasn't a dream. What he'd eaten remained with him. What he'd taken out had disappeared. Karen sat down on the floor in the middle of the empty house and forced himself to think the way he did when unloading barges, calmly, step by step. Fact number 1. At night, a room appears behind the door that isn't there during the day. Fact number 2. At dawn, both the room and everything taken from it disappear. Fact number 3. What he ate remains inside his body, so the boundary doesn't run through the door. That means there's a rule, a hidden condition under which what's taken remains. Grandpa had lived in this house for 40 years and hadn't starved to death during 3 crop failures. The old man knew the condition. Karen looked at the 3 doors. There was a whole day and 11 skilling left until sunset. There were 12 days left until the tax was due. He decided that tonight he wouldn't gorge on cheese like a rat. Tonight, he would test the rules. In the evening, he bought 2 skillings worth of candles and kindling. He divided the table into squares with charcoal and placed a question in each square. He wrote with charcoal on the boards because paper was expensive. His neighbor across the street, an old tinsmith named Tob, saw the candlelight through a crack and told his wife that Odwin's grandson had gone mad on the very first day and was talking to himself in an empty stone sack. At midnight, the lock clicked. Karen stood in front of the doors with a piece of charcoal in his hand. A light came on behind the second door, not behind the third, behind the second. He opened it and saw that it wasn't a storage room. Behind the door stood workbenches, vices, a wall of tools, a foot-powered lathe, a barrel of nails, a stack of dry planks, a workshop. Karen exhaled slowly. Rooms change. No 2 nights are alike. He stepped inside, and at that moment, someone else would have started grabbing tools and dragging them toward the hearth. Karen forced himself to stand still. He remembered the missing sacks. He told himself that the house had already shown that simple looting didn't work. He took a plain block of wood from the shelf, a block of beech wood. He placed a knife, a chisel, and an emery stone next to it. If what he took disappeared, he needed to see what would happen to something he'd altered. He worked until his fingers ached. By 4 o'clock in the morning, a rough but honest spoon had emerged from the block. He simply carried the second piece of wood into the living room, untouched. As the third item, he placed a candle stub on the threshold, one he'd bought that evening and brought in from outside. 3 objects, 3 answers in the morning. He sat down by the workshop door and looked at the tool that cost more than he had earned in 3 years. Just before dawn, his eyes closed of their own accord. A loud bang woke him. Someone was pounding on the front door with a fist. Karen sat up with a start. Gray light seeped under the door. Morning. He glanced at the floor. The untouched block of wood was gone. A candle stub lay where it had been, and next to the stub lay a spoon. The spoon he'd carved with his own hands that night hadn't disappeared. Karen clenched it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. There it was. The house takes what is due to it, but gives back what has been made. Labor within the room transforms the house's possession into a human creation. There was another knock at the door. A man's voice from outside shouted that tax collector Yarvig wished to see the new owner, and that the collector had little time and many debtors. Karen hid the spoon in his bosom and went to open the door. Karen opened the door and saw a thin man in a gray cloak with a tin badge on his chest. Behind the tax collector stood 2 guards with clubs. Yarvig looked over Karen's head into the house and saw an empty room, a bare bed, and a cold hearth. He said he was inspecting the new owner's property to assess the tax. He walked inside without asking. He opened the first door and saw a niche. He opened the second and third and saw more niches. He tapped the granite with the knuckle of his finger. He said that the late Odvin had paid his tax on the dot for 40 years without ever explaining where his income came from. He said the old man had been considered a bit of an oddball. He said that now this oddity had been passed down to his grandson, along with a debt of 40 skilling. Then he leaned toward Karen and added in a lower voice that, personally, he was betting on the marshes. The servants burst out laughing. Yarvig left, leaving a tag with a deadline on the table. 11 days. Karen closed the door and unclenched his fist. His palm was wet. He took out a spoon and placed it on the table. 1 spoon, a rough one. At the market, they'd give a 1/4 skilling for one like that. A night's work for a 1/4 skilling is just a slow path to the marshes. He sat down and began to count differently, the way they count cargo in a ship's hold. It's not the object that matters, it's the rule. The rule says that what is transformed by labor is preserved. The rule says nothing about quantity, and the rule says nothing about the material. If a shipment arrives at night, the grain can be ground. Ground grain is transformed grain. If the workshop arrives, then overnight he can make not just 1 spoon, but prepare dozens of simple items. Handles, combs, toys, anything that cuts quickly and always sells. He slept through half the day so he could make it to midnight with a clear head. In the evening, he spent 3 skilling. He bought hand millstones from the miller's widow, small, worn-down millstones that no one had taken. The widow asked why a porter would need millstones if he had no grain. Karen replied that grain was a profitable business. He carried the millstones into the house and set them by the 3rd door. If the rule required his labor, then he would bring his own tools for the job. At midnight, there was a click. A light came on behind the 3rd door. Karen opened it and recognized the storeroom. The same shelves, the same sacks. The house had returned the storeroom, as if to check whether he had learned his lesson. Karen dragged the millstones inside. He opened the first sack and began grinding. The millstones were small and worn. His arm felt like it was filled with lead by the end of the first hour. He poured the flour into empty sacks from the corner of the storeroom and stopped. The sacks belonged to the house. He paused to think. The flour had been transformed by his labor, but the sack had not. In the morning, he risked finding a pile of flour on the bare floor. He took a needle and twine from the shelf, unpicked the seam on each sack, and sewed it back up by hand. Now the sack, too, bore the mark of his labor. He didn't know if that would be enough. He checked. By dawn, he had ground and resewn 5 sacks. His shoulders were on fire. His palms were covered with blisters on top of old calluses. He carried the sacks into the living room, lay down between them, and told himself he wouldn't fall asleep. He fell asleep. He woke up in a panic and immediately began groping around with his hands. His fingers pressed against the tightly packed burlap. 5 sacks of flour stood around the cot. Real ones. The morning's harvest. His. Karen buried his forehead in a sack and sat there for a long time. Then he sprang into action. He couldn't haul everything to the market all at once. A hungry city spots flour faster than gold. He took a 1/4 of a sack, poured it into his knapsack, and headed not for the main market, but for Coal Street, to the tinsmith Taub. Tob had been repairing teapots for 40 years and knew everyone within 10 streets. Tob trusted no one, and he especially didn't trust Odwin's grandson, who had gone mad and was burning candles in an empty house. Karen set the knapsack on the workbench and said he wanted to trade the flour for an old tool and that he would bring more later. Tob untied the knapsack, sniffed it, rubbed a pinch between his fingers, and froze. The flour was freshly ground. It smelled fresh, in a town where the mills had stood idle for 3 months. Tob looked up at Karen the way one looks at a door behind which something is happening. He asked cautiously where it came from. Karen replied that his grandfather had left behind not only walls, but also connections, and that a wise neighbor doesn't ask a river where its source is. Tob didn't think long. Hunger makes you think fast. He dug out some woodworking knives, files, and a good plane from his chest, and said he'd trade for flour like that every day if he had to, and that his mouth was sealed tight. By evening, the rumor had spread anyway, a quiet rumor down his street, that you could get flour from young Karen without waiting in line and without the city markup. That night, the workshop came, and Karen cut handles and combs until his hands cramped, using tools that were now in good working order. The next night, back at the warehouse, the millstones ground until dawn. He slept 4 hours a day. He ate, standing up. By the 6th day, he had 19 sacks of flour, 40 combs, and 82 skilling in copper from his quiet trade through Toba. The tax payment, counted out in advance, lay on the table. On the due date, Karen was the first to arrive at the tax office. Yarvig saw him and prepared a tag for the marshes. Karen laid exactly 40 skilling on the counter. Then he added another 40 and said he was paying in advance for the next month so as not to take up the tax collector's time twice. Yarvig counted the coins 3 times. He looked at the copper, then at the blisters on the porter's palms, then back at the copper. He handed over 2 receipts without a word. Karen left. Behind his back, Yarvig summoned the clerk and ordered him to pull up all the records for the house on Cole Street going back 40 years. He told the clerk that old Odvin had paid on the due date from an empty house, and that now the young upstart was paying in advance for the empty house. He said that empty houses never come with money. And at the other end of the street, the dealer Falco sat in his shop and listened to the man who had brought him a comb. A fine beechwood comb, freshly cut. The man said that the combs, flour, and handles were being sold by the grandson of the late Odvin. Falco twirled the comb between his fingers. He remembered the smoky granite and the 240 blocks. He remembered how the puppy had looked at the wall as if it were something familiar. Falco put the comb in a box and told the clerk to call Harg. The clerk turned pale. Harg was summoned when conversations ended in words. Harg arrived on the 3rd day, toward evening. He was a head taller than Karen and twice as broad. A weight hung from a strap at his waist. Officially, Harg was collecting debts. Unofficially, after his visits, people sold their houses to Falco for 1/4 of the price. He stood in the doorway of Tob's shop, where Karen was just stacking out flour, and said in a calm voice that every business on this street paid a tithe to Mr. Falco. He said that 30 skilling had accumulated over the past few days, and that from now on it would be 10 a week. He took a comb from the workbench and snapped it in half with 2 fingers. Tob turned pale. Karen stared silently at the shards. He knew the port's arithmetic. He stood no chance against Harg. Not yet, anyway. He said he'd bring the money in a week. Harg smirked and left. Tob hissed that they shouldn't get involved and that they had to pay. Karen replied that once you start paying, you'll never stop. He went home before sunset and sat down in front of the 3 doors. For the first time, he spoke aloud to the house. He said he needed a haul. He felt like a fool. At midnight, the lock clicked. A light came on behind the first door, which had never been opened before. Karen pulled it open and froze. Behind the door was a hall, a long hall with a dirt floor. Leather bags filled with sand hung from chains, racks with wooden and iron projectiles, weights ranging from small to impossible to lift. A wooden dummy covered in felt. Rough charcoal drawings ran along the wall. Stands, strikes, grips, sequences of movements laid out step by step like a blueprint. The house had heard him. Or perhaps the house always gave what was needed most of all. Karen didn't dwell on that now. He took off his shirt and walked over to the drawings. He knew how to fight the way they fought in the port, in a brawl, until the first blood. The drawings showed something else. Short, vicious, precise. He repeated the first sequence until his arms could no longer lift. Then he addressed the question that had brought him here. What can be preserved here? You can't carry a sandbag away, nor can you wash it. He stood in front of the mannequin and realized, it's not an object that's preserved here. It's the body that's preserved here. The muscle built up inside is just like that eaten-away cheese. It leaves with you as you cross the threshold. In the morning, he couldn't lift a cup. After 3 nights in the hall, he lifted the keg he used to roll around. The house didn't change rooms every night, as he'd said, but the hall came often, as if the house were running it on a schedule. Between the halls came the warehouse, and the flour piled up. During the day, Karen slept, ate, and practiced his combinations in the backyard, slowly, like a dance. Mara, the old coal merchant, saw him from her window and told her neighbors that the boy had finally lost his mind and was dancing with thin air. Mara had a sharp tongue. She was the first to laugh at him on the day the inheritance was announced. A week passed. Harg came to Taub's shop at noon, when the street was at its busiest. He loved an audience. He asked where his 30 skilling were. Karen came out of the shop and said there would be no money, not today, nor ever. The street fell silent. Mara leaned out of the window up to her waist. Harg placed his hand on the weight and said he'd break both of the greenhorn's arms and that it would serve as a lesson to the street. He struck without a wind-up, just as he always did. His fist passed through the spot where Karen's head had just been. Karen shifted half a step to the side, just like in illustration number 4. He didn't think any further. His body executed the combination on its own. The edge of his palm to the throat, his toe to the knee, his elbow from above to the collarbone. 3 short sounds. Harg fell to his knees, then face first into the dust, and remained lying there, wheezing. The street was so quiet you could hear the sign creaking. Karen bent down, picked up Harg's weight from the ground, and placed it on Mara's windowsill. He said he was giving it to the street as a memento. Mara stared at him, her mouth agape. That evening, by the well, she told a different story. She said she'd seen with her own eyes how Odvin's grandson had knocked Harg out with 3 blows, and that this young man had his grandfather's spirit, and that she'd always said so. The neighbors nodded. No one reminded her of the dancing with the air. 2 of Falco's apprentices carried Harga away. Falco listened to them and was silent for a long time. Then he told Harga that when he got back on his feet, he should give Cole Street a wide berth. Falco was no fool. He knew how to read between the lines. Pain out of nowhere. A weapon out of nowhere. Now blows out of nowhere. The house on Cole Street was producing the impossible with the consistency of a factory. You don't force something like that with a weight. You study it first. He sat down to write a letter, not to the bailiff, higher up. His cousin served as a clerk for Grimward's commandant, Duval. Falco wrote that a source of food of unknown origin had appeared on Cole Street in quantities worthy of the commandant's attention, and that the tax records did not reflect even a tenth of it. He wrote and smiled. He was best at pulling coals from the fire with someone else's hands. But that night, Karen stood in the middle of the hall and wasn't training. He was thinking. The victory over Harg had cost 3 short sounds, and now the whole street street brought him bread orders and bowed to him. It was pleasant, and it was bad. The port had taught him that the cargo everyone sees first goes overboard. He took a piece of coal and began to write a plan on the back of the door. Not just for tonight, for the next 10 nights. The warehouse provided food, the workshop provided goods, the hall provided the body. The house listened to his need. So need can be steered like a rudder. He wrote in columns. Night 1, the storeroom and grinding a supply to stash away. Night 2, the workshop and making shutters and bolts for his own door, because he has only one door and it's flimsy. Night 3, the living room. He stopped at the 4th line. At the bottom of the page, a thought wrote itself, one that sent a chill down his spine. Grandpa had lived here quietly for 40 years. Grandpa didn't get into fights on the street or openly sell flour. Grandfather knew something about the price of noise. And yet, in the end, he died alone in this house. And before his death, according to the notary, people from the capital came for him 3 times and left empty-handed. Karen finished writing the column by 10 o'clock at night and underlined one word with charcoal: quiet. There was a knock at the door. At night. For the first time ever, someone was knocking on his door at night. The knock was polite, 3 even taps. Neighbors don't knock like that, and neither do the guards. Karen blew out the candle and took a new ash wood handle from the corner. The knock repeated, 3 even taps, and a calm male voice from behind the door said his name and added that the conversation would be about the house and the late Odvin, and that it would be best to open the door while the street was still asleep. Karen didn't open the door. He asked through the door who was speaking. The voice replied that names could wait, and that the guest would stand outside exactly until the end of that thought. The visitor said that the house where Karen lived was listed in an old register, and that the people who maintained that register knew how to wait for years, but did not like it when the owners made a racket. He said that Harg had been lying in the square, making a great deal of noise. Then it grew quiet behind the door. Karen sat there with the handle in his hands until dawn. In the morning, a coin lay on the threshold. Not a skilling, a heavy silver disc without a coat of arms, with a door stamped on one side. Just a door. Karen wrapped the coin in a rag and hid it under a hearthstone. He understood nothing except one thing. His grandfather had been a link in something greater, and that greater thing was now watching him. He wanted to think about it further, but the city had no time for mysteries. By the end of the week, river fever had reached Grimward. It came with the barges every year of famine, but this time it struck hard and wide. The harbor district was laid low in 3 days. Then the fish quarter. People burned with fever until they raved and died on the 5th day if the fever didn't subside. The healer Osmond boiled bark and honestly admitted that the bark didn't cure, it merely bought time. There was only a week's supply of bark left in the city's warehouses. Commandant Duval closed the port, thereby cutting off the city's last grain shipment. Prices went through the roof. A pound of flour cost 20 shillings, and it was nowhere to be found. The line outside Karen's house now began before dawn. He sold at the old price, 8¼ pounds per person, and because of this, rumors about him spread not just through the street, but throughout the entire city. And then the commandant's daughter fell ill. Lissa Duval. She was 9. Everyone found out about it because Duval walked across half the city in broad daylight to Osmond's house and emerged from it looking darker than his uniform. Osmond told the commandant the truth. It was the 5th day of the fever. The disease was running rampant. Karen heard the news at the market and returned home earlier than usual. He sat down across from the door. He didn't know the sick girl and owed nothing to the commandant who had closed the port. But he remembered the plague year and how, at 9 years old, he had sat by his mother's bedside and how no one had come. And he also remembered the cold logic of the situation. The commandant was a wall that either stood between you and the capital's list or was on their side. He told the house aloud that he needed to treat her. At midnight, a light came on behind the second door. There was no workshop behind it. Behind it was a white room. Karen had never seen anything like it. Smooth, light-colored walls, cots covered with clean sheets, cabinets with glass doors. Behind the glass, rows of vials with clear labels in his language, powders, tinctures, needles in sterilized boxes, and books. Thick books where diseases were sorted by symptoms like cargo in ship holds. Karen took a volume with a bookmark from the shelf. The house had placed the bookmark there itself. The section was titled River Rotten Fever. He read until his eyes stung. The symptoms matched perfectly. Waves of fever, a brown rash, delirium on the fourth night. The treatment was laid out hour by hour. Willow powder with gray root every 6 hours. Rub-downs. A sip of water with salt and honey. And most importantly, 3 drops from the vial with the blue seal into water, twice a day for 5 days. Below was a warning that the tincture was potent and that the dose for a child was half as much. Karen took a mortar from the shelf and spent the whole night preparing it. He ground, mixed, and diluted each portion with his own hands because he remembered the rule of the house. The work he had put into it remains. He poured the tincture into his own flask, which he had bought that afternoon. He wrote the dosing schedule hour by hour on a board with charcoal. By dawn, he had 5 days' worth of medicine and a back wet with sweat. Everything was preserved. In the morning, he did not go to the commandant. They wouldn't have let him pass the gate to see the commandant. He went to Osmond. The old doctor received him while standing among the patients and listened with half an ear until Karen set the flask and the board with the schedule on the table and said that this was a remedy for putrid fever and that he was offering Osmond the chance to give it to the commandant's daughter under his own name. Osmond asked why it had to be under someone else's name. Karen replied that people would trust a doctor but not a porter and that he wanted a living child, not fame. Osmond opened the flask, sniffed it, touched a drop to his tongue, and his expression changed. For 40 years, he'd been sniffing out pharmacies from the capital to the border. He said slowly that he'd never encountered such a pure extract even in a university town, and that either the guy was connected to people it was better not to ask about, or he didn't finish his sentence. He stared at Karen over the flask for a long time. Then he said he'd take the remedy, but wouldn't hide the name, because if the girl died, the one who brewed it would be held responsible. Karen nodded. That was fair. Osmond administered the first 3 drops at noon. By nightfall, Lissa's fever had broken for the first time in 6 days. On the 3rd day, she asked for something to eat. On the 5th, she was sitting by the window. Osmond, true to his word, gave the commandant the name. And not just the commandant. He came to Gould Street on his own initiative, stood before Karen in the middle of the street, and, in front of everyone, bowed to him as a colleague. He said loudly that the city needed this mixture in any quantity, and that he was an old fool because 3 days ago he'd suspected this young man of deceit. The line of people outside the house heard every word. By evening, Karen was cooking for more than just one child. It was as if the house had been waiting for this. The white van now came every other night, and Karen worked in it until dawn. During the day, he slept for 3 hours and handed flasks to Osmond. The supply was enough for dozens of patients. The deaths at the port stopped on the 9th day. People on the street began to call his house the Good House. Mara sold hot herbal tea on the corner near his house and told everyone that she had always known. And then they came for him from the citadel. 2 soldiers politely but firmly stated that Commandant Duval wished to speak with him, and that disobedience was not an option. Karen walked through the city between the 2 uniforms and saw people watching from their windows. Duval received him alone in his office, with a map on the table. He was gray-haired and spoke briefly. He said he owed Karen his daughter's life, and that such debts must be repaid. Then he placed his palm on the table and spoke the second part. He said that over the course of a week, 3 documents had accumulated in his office. A report on flour of unknown origin, a report on a man who had subdued a debt collector using military-style techniques not taught in Grimward, and a letter from a doctor regarding a remedy not brewed in this country. He said that all 3 documents concerned the same house. He looked Karen in the eye and asked directly what was in the house on Cole Street. And while Karen remained silent, searching for the right words, there was a knock at the office door, and a clerk, Falco's cousin, entered and placed a dispatch from the road in front of the commandant. Duval read it, and his face grew somber. He said that the matter was postponed until another time, because an inspector from the capital's property chamber was on his way to Grimward with the authority to inspect any buildings. He said the inspector would be in town in 6 days, and that the order specified the address, Cole Street. Karen left the Citadel and walked home, his legs feeling like lead. 6 days. He wasn't afraid of an inspection during the day. During the day, the house was an empty shell with 3 alcoves. It was something else that frightened him. An inspector with the proper authority could seal off the house, take it over, and post a guard for the night. One night with a stranger inside, and the secret ceases to be a secret. He was thinking about this so deeply that he only noticed he was being followed once he reached his own street. 2 of them. One was drinking by the well for far too long. The second followed him from the bridge, switching sides of the street. They were clumsy. Karen's sharp eyes took in both of them. He gave nothing away, went inside the house, and slid in a new bolt made during the second night in the workshop. He didn't have to wait long. The thieves came at 3 o'clock in the morning. Karen wasn't asleep. He sat in the darkness of the living room and listened as they scraped against the stone outside. 2 of them were climbing up. One stayed by the door. The second climbed onto the flat roof and fumbled around there for a long time to no avail, because the roof was solid stone without a single seam. Then they set to work on the door. The bolt held. And then something happened that Karen hadn't planned on. At midnight, the lock clicked as usual, and the light came on behind the first door, the hall. The house followed its own schedule and paid no attention to the thieves. A strip of light stretched across the entire room and seeped through the crack at the threshold out into the night. It grew quiet outside. Then a voice called out to his partner in a strained whisper, saying there was a light inside and that a light was burning in the middle of the night in a house with no windows and no smoke. The second man hissed that this was exactly what they'd been sent to find and pressed hard against the door. The oak creaked. Karen stood up in the darkness, flexed his fingers, and opened the bolt himself. The first one flew inside with a crowbar, carried by momentum, and Karen tackled him mid-motion, just as the wall of drawings had taught him. A hip throw onto the stone floor knocked both the crowbar and the air out of the thief. The second one leaped in after him with a knife. Karen moved toward the light, and for a split second, the thief glimpsed, through the half-open door, a hall that couldn't possibly exist. That split second was enough. Knot number 7 snapped with a muffled thud, and the second thief lay down next to the first. Karen tied them both up with their own rope and sat down across from them. He didn't hit them or threaten them. He said he would now open the door for them to go outside and let them go, and that before doing so, he would simply ask them to describe what they had seen. He said they'd seen the light from the host's thief's lantern. The host hadn't been asleep. He said that if they told the client about the room that couldn't possibly exist, the client wouldn't believe them at first, but then, just to be safe, would have them both eliminated as loose lips, because secrets of that magnitude don't like witnesses. The thieves were silent and thought. They were right. Karen untied them and cast them out into the darkness. In the morning, he learned from Tob that 2 strangers had hurriedly taken horses at the northern gate. He couldn't verify whether they'd lied to the client or not, but he did get an answer to the question he'd been afraid to ask. A stranger could see the room. The room isn't hidden from strangers' eyes. Only the door and the door's keeper can hide it. That meant he had one job for the next 6 nights, to ensure that by the time the inspector arrived, the house would be ready for any inspection at any hour. He took out the charcoal list on the door and rewrote the entire thing. He no longer asked the house for a room for the night. He prioritized his needs. He had long since noticed that the house responds not to words, but to whatever gnaws at it most intensely. So he had to gnaw according to a plan. He spent the day bringing a need into clear focus. He spent the night resolving it. On the first night, the workshop came, and Karen built a false bottom for the hearth and a false wall in the niche of the third door with a gap wide enough for a palm. Now he had hiding places inside the daytime house. On the second night, the warehouse came, and he ground up and stashed a month's supply in the hiding places, while distributing the excess through Tab and Mara on credit, on their word of honor, because supplies left in plain sight are evidence, while supplies stored in the grateful homes of others form a human shield. On the third night, he went to the white compartment and prepared 2 weeks' worth of medicine for Osmond, and separately assembled a small box containing the strongest remedies he could find according to the book. On the fourth night, he went to the hall and didn't train until he dropped, but instead memorized a new section of drawings on the wall that he had previously skipped, the section on operations against armed forces. On the fifth night, the house did something for the first time that it had never done before. Lights came on behind 2 doors at once, the warehouse and the workshop in a single night. Karen stood between the 2 strips of light and realized that this was the answer. The house sensed that the owner had stopped merely grabbing and had begun to take control. The house had added sales. It worked on both rooms that night and was exhausted by dawn, but the column by the door was completely covered, and one final question remained unanswered. A silver coin under the hearthstone. The guest had said the house was on the list. The inspector had gone to the address, not based on Falco's tip. Falco's tip had gone to the commandant, not to the capital. That meant the capital had known about the house before, and the tip had been merely a pretext or a coincidence. Karen turned the coin over in the candlelight. The door on the silver coin was carved with 3 hinges. He looked up at his own black front door. 3 wrought iron hinges. He took the candle and, for the first time in days, examined the door itself as an object rather than as a passageway. On the inside, beneath the top hinge, a mark the size of a fingernail was burned into the wood, the same door as on the coin, and beneath it were 3 diagonal notches. He slid his hand lower. Beneath the middle hinge, the mark was repeated, but there were 2 notches. Beneath the bottom one, there was 1, a tally. Someone had been keeping track on this door, and the last mark was fresher than the others. His grandfather hadn't left him a house with a trick. His grandfather had left him a post. A knock on the door cut off his train of thought. Standing outside the door was a breathless young messenger from the citadel, who said the commandant had ordered him to deliver 2 words. The inspector anticipated the note. His travel carriage had passed the southern outpost an hour ago. Not in 6 days. Today. Karen looked at the crack under the door. There were 4 hours left until midnight. For the first time, he caught himself having a thought that made him feel a chill and a sudden clarity. He didn't know which he wanted more, for the house to remain silent that night, or for the house to show the inspector from the old list everything it was capable of. Karen didn't wait for the inspector at the door. Waiting was the worst of strategies. He took a clean shirt, counted the tax receipts, stacked them on the table in plain sight, and went to the citadel himself. He asked the commandant for 5 minutes. Duval received him immediately. Karen said he'd heard about the inspector's arrival and asked the commandant to personally be present during the search of his house. Duval raised an eyebrow. Usually people asked for delays or intercession. This one was asking for a witness. Karen explained calmly. He said his house was empty and that it would be easy to plant anything there if the search were conducted without outside eyes. He said that a man who had traveled from the capital for a week wouldn't write in his report that he'd found bare walls. He said that such a man needed to find something, otherwise the trip would have been a waste. Duval listened and recalled his own youth during garrison inspections. The young man reasoned like an old quartermaster, not like a porter. The commandant said he would come. Reneld, the inspector of the property chamber, turned out to be a short man with a soft voice and eyes that never lingered on anything for more than a moment. He didn't stay at an inn, but in the citadel, which was a statement in itself. That evening, he studied the papers. In the morning, he stood on Cole Street in front of Karen's house with 2 clerks and 4 soldiers as an escort. escort. Duval arrived as promised. Half the street turned out as well. Mara took her place in the front row with a basket, just like at the theater. Reneld walked around the house 3 times. He felt the masonry. He measured the walls with his strides, first on the outside and then on the inside, while the clerks jotted down the numbers. Karen stood by the hearth and watched as the inspector did what Karen himself had done on the first day. Reneld opened the first door and examined the niche. He tapped the back wall with his knuckles. He ordered a clerk to bring a weighted cord and measured the depth bin. He repeated the same procedure with the second and third doors. The measurements matched. The exterior and interior walls were the same thickness. The house was a solid stone box. Reneld sat down at Karen's table without being invited, opened the folder, and spoke softly. He said that the house on Cole Street had been listed in the Chamber's registry with a special entry for 71 years. He said that the entry had been made before the late Audwin was born, and that the wording in it was old and strange. The building was inalienable and subject to annual inspection during daylight hours. He said that for 70 years the Chamber had sent people here once a year, and for 70 years they had returned with the same report of empty walls. He looked up at Karen and asked why, in his opinion, an empty shell was protected from alienation by the Chamber itself, and why the inspection was limited to daylight hours. Karen held his gaze and replied that he had owned the house for 3 weeks, while the inspector had been on the registry for 71 years, and that the question was directed at the wrong person. The street outside the door snorted 30 times. Reneld did not smile. He closed the folder and continued. He said that in the capital, the record for the house was held by a department that no longer existed. The department had been disbanded 60 years ago, and its archives had burned down. All that remained was a single line in the registry and the obligation for an annual inspection, which the Chamber carried out of habit. He said he had come to settle the matter once and for all. Either he would find grounds for the entry, or he would submit a proposal to revoke its special status, at which point the house would become ordinary property. Ordinary property, in wartime, is subject to requisition for the needs of the garrison. He said this, looking not at Karen, but at Duval. Duval remained silent. Karen felt the ground slipping away from under his feet, slowly and politely. The inspector wasn't looking for a hiding place. The inspector was removing the paper shield that had covered the house for 70 years. Without the special entry, the house would be seized as a fodder warehouse in a month, and no commandant would be able to help, because the law would be on the Chamber's side. Reneld stood up, brushed off his sleeve, and added, as he was already in the doorway, that he would be staying in town for a week, and that if the owner had anything to say about the nature of the special entry, he was ready to listen any day before his departure. He left. The crowd dispersed, disappointed by the lack of a spectacle. Duval lingered in the doorway and said quietly that he could delay the requisition for a month or two, no longer, and that he remembered the debt for his daughter, but that the commandant was a nobody against the Chamber. Karen was left alone amid his bare walls, which had just ceased to be a fortress. He sat down and laid out the task like cargo in a hold. To save the house, he needed the basis for the old record. The people who made the record 71 years ago knew that basis. There is no department. There is no archive. But there is a coin bearing the symbol of the door. There's a scorched tally on his own door. And there's a nocturnal visitor who said the lists are still being kept. That means the heirs of the burned-down agency are alive and walk the streets at night. The house was their outpost, and his grandfather was the caretaker. Karen needed to find those who had left the coin before Reneld wrote his report. He turned the coin over by candlelight for the 100th time, and for the 100th time he saw only a door with 3 hinges. Then he did what he always did when an object remained silent. He began to think about the object with his hands. The coin was heavier than silver of that size. He weighed it in his palm against the skilling coins. The difference was small, but it was there. At midnight, the workshop came to life, and Karen placed the coin in a vice ice, wrapped in leather, and made the thinnest of cuts along the rim. Beneath the silver layer lay another metal, dark and layered, and hidden within that layer was a strip. He pulled it out with a needle, unfolded it, and saw a line of dots. The line was short, the embankment of the burned-down shipyard. The third pile, high tide. Karen sat poring over the strip until dawn. This wasn't an address for just anyone. It was an address for whoever figured out how to open the coin, the caretaker's test. The old man would have passed it without a second thought. Karen passed it in 6 days. The following evening, he stood at twilight by the burned-down shipyard on the south shore. Black pilings jutted out of the water like rotten teeth. He counted the 3 and waited for the high tide. The water rose and covered the lower marks on the pilings. On the third piling, just below the high tide line, a recess opened up that had been covered by accumulated shell rock at low tide. An oil-stained bundle lay in the recess. Karen reached for it and heard a voice behind him. A voice he'd heard once before through a door. The voice said that the boy was faster than his grandfather. His grandfather had pondered the coin for 11 days. Karen didn't turn around right away. First, he tucked the bundle into his shirt front, and only then did he turn his whole body, shifting his weight to his back leg as the hall's wall had taught him. At the water's edge stood a man in a travel cloak, without a lantern. Not young, lean. His hands were in plain sight. He said he could be called Vet, and that he wouldn't fight because he'd come to talk. If he'd come for another reason, Karen wouldn't have heard his footsteps. Karen asked what was in the bundle. Vet replied that the bundle contained the keys to the conversation and suggested they sit on an overturned boat because the conversation would be a long one. He spoke with the calmness of someone accustomed to explaining complex matters to weary people. 70 years ago, the country had a department of deep structures. It kept records of houses like the one on Cole Street. Vet knew of 11 such houses in the entire kingdom. No one built them. They were found. A house would appear in the city quietly, with its own walls and its own memory, and choose its owner on its own, through inheritance, through purchase, or through a coincidence that was no coincidence at all. The agency did not understand the nature of these houses, and therefore did the only sensible thing. It shielded them from outsiders with paperwork and assigned a caretaker to each one. Then there was a change of government in the capital. The new people wanted not to observe, but to make use of them. They seized 2 houses for the treasury by force. Vet fell silent at this point, and Karen asked what had become of those houses. Vet said that both houses had ceased to open their doors forever, and that both cities where they stood had burned to the ground within a year, consumed by fires that began from within the empty, sealed walls. After that, what remained of the agency burned its own archives, officially disbanded itself on paper, and faded into the shadows. What remained was the Brotherhood of Watchers, nameless, without a charter, and unpaid. 11 houses, 11 watchers, and a few liaisons like Vet who kept them connected. Odvin had been a keeper for 40 years. The notches on the door marked the number of times he'd checked the connection. Vet came to see him once every 3 years. Karen listened and tallied the numbers. Then he asked the question that had made these past 3 weeks worth living. He asked what the house wanted from a caretaker. For the first time, Vet looked at him with interest. He said that in 70 years, none of the young people had ever asked what the house wanted. Everyone had asked what the house could give. Vet said that no one had a precise answer, but there was an observation. Houses are generous to those who build a life around them, and stingy to those who bleed them dry. Under the old man, Odwin's house had opened almost nothing but the storeroom for decades because the old man was afraid and took only food. Under Karen, the house had revealed 4 rooms and 2 doors in a single night over the course of 3 weeks. Wet said he'd never seen such a pace, and that was precisely why he was sitting on a wet boat right now instead of following his usual route. Then he got down to business. The bundle. Karen unwrapped the oil-stained cloth. Inside lay a thin book with a lead cover and a seal. Vet explained. The book was the observation log of the first caretaker of this house. The seal was an authentic seal of the Department of Deep Structures, one of the 3 that had survived. The department had been disbanded, but not abolished by law. The difference was just one word, but that word was worth holding on to. The decree on disbandment was signed, but no one signed the decree abolishing the records, because there was no one left to sign it. This means the entry in the Chamber's registry remains valid to this day, and an inspector can remove it only by proving that the basis for the entry has disappeared. The seal proves the opposite. The basis is still valid. That said that for 70 years, the Brotherhood had resolved such matters quietly through clerks and bribes, but that times had changed. Inspector Reneld won't accept that. Vet checked. Reneld is honest and stubborn, and that makes him more dangerous than a thief. To an honest man, you must show the truth, or at least a convincing part of the truth. Vet placed Karan's seal in his palm and said that the decision rests with the caretaker, because only the caretaker can risk the house. He stood up, brushed off the sand, and added one last thing. He said that the Brotherhood has an enemy older than the inspector. The people who took 2 houses 70 years ago haven't disappeared. Their heirs now serve in the secret chancellery and call themselves the guardians of the crown. They've been searching for the remaining 9 houses all these years. The thieves Karen had let go were their tentacles. And the dispatch about the house had been sent to the capital, not just to the chamber. Vet said that Karen had 2 fires burning on either side of him and advised him to light a third of his own. Then he disappeared into the darkness so that after 10 steps he could no longer be served. Karen walked home along the long road, lost in thought. He read the first caretaker's diary by candlelight until midnight. The handwriting was neat and precise. The first caretaker wrote that the house responds to need, but responds most strongly to a need that is shared. The entries broke off on the page where the pen had carved a groove. The last line said that that night, the house had opened a door that does not exist. Karen reread it 3 times. There are 3 doors in the house. The first caretaker wrote about a 4th. The rest of the pages had been cut out, not torn out, cut out with a knife along a ruler. Someone had taken the knowledge of the 4th door and done it neatly. At midnight, the lock clicked, and Karen set the diary aside. He went to the training hall and spent an hour practicing against a dummy with a knife, but his mind wasn't on the task. His mind was calculating. He had a week and the seal. You can only play with an honest inspector using truth measured out with a pharmacist's precision. To show the seal is to admit a connection to the Brotherhood. To hide the seal is to lose one's home by law. He left the hall before dawn, sat down at the table, and began to prepare the conversation just as he would prepare a medicine, drop by drop. In the morning, he sent a boy to the Citadel with a note for Reneld. The note contained a single sentence. The owner of the house on Cole Street is ready to explain the basis for the special entry and requests a meeting with the commandant. The reply arrived around noon. Reneld scheduled the meeting for 10 o'clock the next morning in the commandant's office. That evening, Mara knocked on Karen's door and announced from the doorway that strangers had been standing at the north gate since yesterday. 4 of them. They're neither merchants nor soldiers. They're dressed differently, but they all have the same boots. She said that an old woman may not know much, but she can recognize boots. Karen thanked her and bolted the door. The guardians of the crown had arrived before their official papers. The 3rd fire had to be lit today. In the morning, Karen entered the commandant's office with a flat box under his arm. Reneld was sitting by the window with a folder open. Duval was standing by the map. Karen set the box on the table, opened it, and laid out 3 items in the order he'd rehearsed the night before. First came a sheet with an excerpt from the registry, which he'd obtained the day before from the chamber clerk for 2 skilling. Second was a closed, lead-bound book. The third was the seal. He spoke briefly. He said that the entry regarding the house had been made by the Department of Underground Structures. He said that the department had been disbanded, but its records had not been abolished, and he suggested that Reneld verify this using his own lists of decrees, since Karen himself was no lawyer, whereas the inspector was the most knowledgeable person in the room. He said that the department's seal before him was genuine and had been passed down to him along with the house and the duty. He emphasized the word duty and fell silent. Raneld took the seal. He examined it for a long time. He took a sheet of paper from his folder, pressed the seal into the wax, and compared the impression with something in his papers. Then he looked up and asked the one question Karen had feared. He asked what the duty entailed. Karen replied with a prepared drop of truth. He said that the caretaker's duty was to keep the building intact, not to alienate it, not to rebuild it, and to pass it on to the next person. He said that his grandfather had carried out this duty for 40 years, paying taxes on the empty house out of his own pocket, and that if the inspector needed the meaning of the entry, there it was. There were certain things the state had once decided simply to preserve without asking why. Just as the standard of measurement was kept in the Capitol's chamber, no one asks why the standard exists. Raneld remained silent for a very long time. Duval did not intervene. Finally, the inspector said that the impression matched the reference in his registry notebook and that this was sufficient grounds to leave the entry alone. He said he would note in his report that the status had been confirmed by the presentation of the seal and would close the matter for the coming years. Then he folded up the papers and added, in a different tone, without the usual bureaucratic formality, he said that he'd been cataloging property for 30 years and had learned to recognize when people weren't telling him the whole truth. He said that today he hadn't been told the whole truth, but that it had been told to him by a man who pays his taxes on time, treats other people's children, and asks for witnesses during his own search. He said that such a combination of oddities unsettled him more than many instances of complete truth. He bowed to the commandant and left. Karan stood there and felt the tension leave his back. Duval grunted and said that now he understood how the young man had taken down Harg in 3 moves, but the joy lasted only until evening. That evening, Tobbs sent his grandson with the news that 4 men in identical boots had rented a house across from the southern end of Cole Street from the heirs of the old laundress and were paying in silver without haggling. The guardians were no longer hiding. They sat down across from him and began to watch. Karen understood their plan without any hints. They didn't need a search. A search would have yielded empty walls, just as it had for Raneld. What they needed was the night. They needed to enter once at midnight when a light was on behind the door. And for that, they needed Karen to be unable to lock his door at least once. Illness, arrest, fire, debt, a quarrel with the city, any lever would do. So his defense wasn't a bolt. His defense was the city that needed him. Vet called it the third fire. Karen began to stoke it that very week, broadly and deliberately. Through Osmond, he announced that the house on Cole Street was accepting medical apprentices. Osmond selected 2 apprentices himself, and during the day, Karen taught them what he himself had memorized at night from the books in the white compartment. Rubbing, dosage, symptoms. Through Tobb, he loaned tools to 6 craftsmen who were out of work because the port was closed. The agreement was simple. A third of the goods would go to the communal storehouse on Cole Street, and prices were to be kept fair. Mara took charge of the soup kitchen and the morning bread line. Within 2 weeks, the street ceased to be Falco's debtors' street and became a small settlement that revolved around a gray, windowless house. People came from other parts of the city to sign on as apprentices or simply to watch. Duval sent 2 retired soldiers to patrol the neighborhood at night, and everyone understood whose neighborhood it was. And the house responded. The house now opened 2 doors every night, and all 3 once a week. Karen slept for 3 hours at a time, but organized his nights like shifts at the port. For the first third of the night, he worked alone. During the second third, he began doing what the first caretaker had warned against in a single line in the diary, and what Karen had decided to test for himself. He began letting people inside. The first he let in was Tobb. The old man stood in the doorway of the workshop and wept for the first time in 30 years, because he had never held such a tool in his hands before. The house's rule applied to the guest only partially. Whatever Tob created inside was preserved if Karen put his own hand to the work, even if only for the final stroke. The caretaker was the key to it all. Osmond was the second to enter the White Chamber. He emerged an hour later, his hair even grayer, with a stack of transcribed recipes, and said that now he would die in peace. Production tripled. The settlement began selling medicine and flour to the neighboring town, where the fever was just breaking out. Money flowed in like a river, and Karen stashed it not in a chest, but in the walls. He bought 2 neighboring houses from Falco, at Falco's own extortionate price, multiplied by a factor of 10. Falco sold because he was the second person in the entire town to realize which way the wind was blowing, and decided it was better to be a rich neighbor than a poor enemy. He even sent Karen a barrel of southern wine with a note saying that business people only quarrel as long as it's profitable. Karen gave the wine to Mare and kept the note. People like Falco are useful as long as they're both afraid and profiting at the same time. Everything had been going too smoothly, and Karen was waiting to see where the blow would strike. It struck where he wasn't looking. One night in the 6th week, he was awakened not by the lock on his door, but by a bell, the city's alarm bell. He rushed out into the street and saw a glow over the southern end of town. The house the Guardians had rented was on fire. It was burning strangely from the inside, with an even white flame and no smoke. 4 residents stood on the street, unharmed, looking not at their own fire, but across the street at Karen's house. And the eldest among them, catching Karen's gaze, slowly spread his arms as a magician does, showing his empty palms. In the morning, on the ruins, there was no source of the fire or any cause. And by noon, all of Grimward knew, from hearsay, the news that no one had verified but everyone was repeating, that the Grey House on Cole Street was cursed, that old Odwin had been engaged in dark dealings at night, and his grandson was continuing them, that he himself had brought the fever to the city to sell his potion, that the fire was a sign. The rumor spread like a wave from the southern end, and someone was skillfully fanning the flames. At Boiled Mara's, for the first time in a month, the bread didn't sell out. The mother of one of the students took her son away to keep him out of harm's way. People from other streets began to bypass the settlement. The guards couldn't open the door by force or with paper. Now they were setting fire to whatever Karen was standing on, the city. You can't fight a rumor with a number 7 rope. Karen understood this immediately and made no excuses. An excuse feeds a rumor better than silence. That evening, in Toba Osmond's storehouse, he gathered Mara and 2 retired soldiers and laid out the war like unloading cargo. A rumor rests on 3 piles: the dark nights of the Grey House, potion and fever, white fire. Each pillar requires its own crowbar. The crowbar for the fever had been ready for a long time. The next day, Osmond posted a list with the tally at City Hall and in the 3 marketplaces. So many sick were admitted, so many survived. Street names, dates. At the bottom was a note stating that the records were open and anyone could approach any survivor and ask. Against the 117 names of the living, the rumor about the potion began to fizzle out because every name had neighbors. After the fire, Karen went to see Reneld, who had not yet left and was still finishing his reports. He asked the inspector, as an impartial representative of the chamber, to examine the ruins and record that the source of the fire was inside the residents' living quarters and not outside. Reneld examined the site, made the entry, and certified it with his seal because it was the plain truth, and an honest man does not deny the truth. The sheet with his report was placed next to Osmond's bill. The main pillar remained: dark nights. And then Karen made a move that made Tob clutch his heart. He announced through the town crier that on the coming new moon, the Grey House on Cole Street would be open to the town all night, from sunset to sunrise. Anyone could come in to look around and stay there until morning. Tob hissed that it was madness. Karen replied that madness was a house that hid itself. Night fell. So many people had gathered that they were standing in the courtyard. Mara was brewing a potion for everyone. People touched the walls, peered into the 3 niches, shone candles into the corners, and waited for the dreadful to happen. At midnight, Karen stood by the back wall, holding his breath. He didn't know what the house would do. He had staked everything on a single line from the first caretaker's diary. The house responds to a shared need. That night's need was one for all, and it was that the doors would not open. The lock did not click. The light did not come on. The house stood until dawn, a simple stone box crammed with yawning townspeople. Someone fell asleep by the hearth. Someone beat Tob at dice. At dawn, people dispersed with laughter, and the rumor died down by noon because 200 people had seen the boring truth with their own eyes. And the boring truth kills a terrifying fairy tale once and for all. Karen closed the door behind the last guest, slid down the wall, and sat there for an hour. The house had remained silent for his sake all night long, or perhaps along with him. He placed his palm on the warm stone floor, and for the first time said, "Thank you," to the house out loud. The following night, the lock clicked as if nothing had happened, and the lights came on beneath all 3 doors at once. And then the house did what the first caretaker had written about. Karen stood in the middle of the living room between the 3 strips of light and saw a 4th. A thin line of light cut through the back wall where there had been no wall, where his grandfather's shelf had hung for 40 years. The stone split along a seam that hadn't existed, and a 4th door stood in the wall, a low one, old, made of the same black wood as the front door. Karen stepped closer and saw a mark burned into it, a door with 3 hinges, the same one as on the coin. The house didn't reveal this to just anyone. The house revealed this to the caretaker who had staked everything on it. Karen grabbed the ring and pulled. There was no room behind the 4th door. Beyond it was a corridor, a stone corridor stretching farther ahead than it should have, because after 3 steps it should have led through the wall onto the street, but it didn't. Doors lined the walls of the corridor. Karen counted them as he walked slowly with his candle. 10 doors, 5 on each side. Each bore the house's symbol burned into it. Different symbols: a tower, a mill, a ship, a bridge, a well. And beneath each symbol was a tally of notches, just like on his front door. He stood in the middle of the hallway and realized what he was seeing. 11 houses, Vet had said. Here they were. The house on Cole Street wasn't just a collection of rooms. It was a hub, a corridor connecting all the houses of the Brotherhood. That was what had been cut out of the diary. That was what the Guardians had been hunting for 70 years. Not a flower warehouse. A road that connects the country more directly than any highway. One door at the end of the corridor stood out from the rest. It was boarded up crisscross with blackened planks, and a symbol on it had been burned into the wood and then burned again over it in the shape of a cross. Karen held up a candle. Beneath the soot, the symbol of a burning tower was visible, one of the 2 ruined houses. The Brotherhood had barred the way to the dead. He did not touch the boards. He turned back, stepped out, and the 4th door closed behind him, and the wall became a wall again. Until dawn, he sat poring over the diary and the coin, thinking that now he knew the value of everything, and of his own life as well. In the morning, 2 pieces of news arrived. The first was brought by a boy from Duval's. The Guardians had left the city, all 4 of them, heading north. The second was brought by Wet, who walked into the store in broad daylight like an ordinary customer, bought a comb, and left a folded sheet of paper on the counter beneath the coin. The sheet contained 3 lines. The mill house fell silent. The caretaker had disappeared 6 days ago. If a passage has opened up for you, you know what to do faster than I do. Karen stood over the note and felt the lines coming together. The Guardians had left for the north. 3 weeks' journey to the north lay the town of Olesboro near the old mill. He'd never been there, but now he didn't need 3 weeks. He just had to wait until midnight and open the door in the corridor marked with the mill symbol, if it opened, and if no one was waiting on the other side. He looked at his people, at Tob, who was counting the day's takings, at the apprentices grinding powders under Osman's shouts, at Mara, who was arguing with a supplier across the street. The settlement lived and thrived on him, and yet he was about to step through that door at night, 300 versts away, to the place where someone like him had vanished. Karen took a piece of charcoal and began writing a column, a list of what to take from the 3 rooms that night: medicines, tools, and 2 hours in the hall to finish things off. By midnight, Karen had managed to check everything off the list. He told the truth to Tob, and only to him, because the settlement needed someone who knew where the master was. Tob listened silently to the story about the corridor, then said that old Odwin had once let slip over a glass of wine that it was closer from his house to the sea than from the port, and had laughed. And for 40 years, Tob had considered it a joke. He promised to keep the storeroom and tell everyone that Karen had come down with a cold. At midnight, all 3 doors clicked open, and Karen worked as if it were his last shift. From the white compartment, he gathered a box of medicines and bandages, arranging each item with his own hands. From the workshop, he took a flint lantern, a coil of rope, a crowbar, and a knife in its sheath, one he'd assembled himself, from the handle to the blade. He spent an hour in the hall practicing restraints against armed opponents and breathing exercises. Then he stood before the back wall and called out his need. He had to go to Olsbro. A sliver of light cut through the stone. The corridor awaited him. The door marked with the mill symbol was the 3rd on the right. The notches beneath the sign had long since worn away. The miller hadn't been seen in years. Karen placed his palm against the wood and pushed. The door moved heavily, as if unlubricated, and swung open into the darkness, which smelled of wet grain and cold. He stepped inside and found himself in a house that looked just like his own, like a twin. The same room, the same hearth, only everything had been turned upside down. The bench was split, the table was overturned, grain and shards were scattered across the floor. A dark stain of dried blood stood out on the wall at shoulder height. A fight had taken place here 6 days ago, and the owner had fought with his back to the wall. Karen crouched down by the stain and began to read the room like cargo. Boot prints from 3 different pairs. One pair had a horseshoe on the left heel. The front door was intact and locked from the inside with a bolt, so they hadn't come in through it. He looked up at the back wall of the mill. That meant the caretaker had been taken while his own hallway was open. Or they'd lured him out, and he'd opened it himself. Karen carefully slid the bolt aside and cracked open the front door. Outside lay the nighttime square of a small town. The mill's wing loomed dark against the sky. Lights were on in 2 windows across the way. The town wasn't awake this late unless there were strangers in it. He crept out like a shadow along the wall and circled Olsbro along the edge in an hour. He found the strangers at the inn. In the courtyard stood 4 Grimward male-breed horses, worn out from the journey. The guards had covered 3 weeks' worth of travel in 6 days, changing horses along the way. They'd been here since yesterday. That meant they weren't the ones who'd taken the caretaker. Someone else had taken him earlier, and these 4 had arrived to find the job already done. Karen lay down on the roof of the woodshed across the way and waited, listening. As morning approached, the inn's door opened and 2 men stepped out. The older one, the one who'd been spreading his arms by the fire, and the stocky one with the lantern. They passed within 10 paces of the shed, and the older one was scolding the stocky one angrily but quietly. Karen caught snippets of their conversation. The older man said that the capital's detachment had gone too far, that the caretaker was needed alive and able to speak, not like this, and that now all hope lay with the cellar because the dead owner's house was as silent as those 2. He repeated the word cellar and nodded toward the mill. They walked on. Karen lay on the firewood, and the cold didn't come from the planks. The miller was dead. His own hunters had killed him, having gone too far. And the house, now orphaned, had fallen silent. But something alive remained in the mill's cellar, and for that reason, the four of them were stuck in this remote little town. He let the two of them step aside to wipe away their tears and walk toward the mill with his back to them. He found the cellar by following fresh tracks. The door led into an earthen slope behind the mill, and a sentry was sitting on a log by the door, young, shivering, with a short blade on his lap. Karen emerged from around the corner with the gait of a sleepy laborer, yawned, and asked if the miller was spending the night there, since he brought grain to the miller that evening. The sentry jumped to his feet, and for a split second wavered between shouting an order and drawing his blade. That split second was enough. The struggle against the armed man ended with a soft sound, and the sentry fell asleep on his log, bound with his own belt and gagged with a piece of his own scarf. Karen took the key from him and unlocked the cellar. Down below, under the low vaulted ceiling, a girl of about Tlaster sat on straw by the wall, her ankle chained to a ring. She was thin, with angry, dry eyes without a single tear. She watched the man entering with a lantern in silence, and crouched like a small animal before a leap. Karen stopped at the entrance without approaching. He said he'd come from the people who keep track of the doors. He took out a coin bearing the door's symbol, placed it on the floor within the circle of light, and nudged it toward her. The girl grabbed the coin, looked at the door with its 3 hinges, and began to cry silently, breaking down in an instant from a little animal into a child. She said her name was Ilma, that the miller, Hart, was her grandfather. That 6 nights ago, soldiers, not these ones but others in black, had come, and her grandfather had managed to shove her into the crawl space under his house, while he himself remained by the back wall. She had heard everything from above. Then the strangers found her, too. The leader in black asked her grandfather about the door in the wall, but her grandfather laughed in his face, so they beat him, and he died laughing without saying a word. They locked her in the cellar and told her that since the house had obeyed her grandfather, it would now obey her grandfather's blood, and that clever people from the capital would come for her. Karan listened, and the old, dark, port-born fury rose within him, but he breathed in time with the hall's rhythm, and the fury sank to the bottom like ballast. The smart people from the capital were those 4. They had come to see if the dead house would open up to the caretaker's granddaughter. Gart's house was silent, not because it had died. The house was silent because it was waiting for the heiress who had been stolen from it. Karan knocked the chain ring off with a crowbar on his second strike. He asked Ilma if she could make her way quietly across the square. She wiped her face, nodded, and turned back into a little beast. They emerged from the cellar into the gray dawn and walked with their backs turned. They could already see the miller's house when an alarm bell rang out from the direction of the inn. The sentry had been found. Boots clattered down the street, 4 pairs. One, with a horseshoe on the left heel, clanged against the stone louder than the others. 40 paces of open square remained to Garth's door. Karen took Ilma by the hand and said that now they would not walk quickly, but very quickly. They ran. Ilma flew alongside him, lighter than a cat, and Karen realized that 6 days in the cellar hadn't slowed her down. 30 paces. 20. From the alley on the right, a stocky man with a lantern and a dagger darted out across their path. He was closer to the door than they were. Karen didn't slow down. He pushed Ilma behind him in an arc without breaking her stride, and charged the stocky man head on, just as he'd been taught in the section on fighting an armed opponent. The blade grazed him, slashing his sleeve. Karen's elbow struck him under the chin. The stocky man sat down on the stones and lay down. The door to Garth's house was already 5 steps away and was closed, while behind them the square was filling with boots. Ilma leaped toward the door first, struck the black wood with her palm, and shouted that she was home. The The bolt had been pushed in from the inside by Karen himself. He knew that. He'd bolted it himself as he left through the back wall. And yet the door opened. It swung inward of its own accord, just as a door opens for a master who's been awaited for 6 nights. They burst into the room, and the door slammed shut behind them. The bolt slid into its brackets with the same sound as a question being settled. Outside, they struck the oak door first with their bodies, then with a crowbar. The door held firm. Karen pulled Ilma toward the back wall and called out in desperation, but the back wall remained silent, and he began to fear that the corridor opened only from his house. And then he saw that Ilma was standing in the middle of the room, her hand resting on her grandfather's overturned table, crying, and that beams of light had been cutting through the back wall for a second now. The miller's house hadn't opened the corridor for him. The house had opened the corridor for her, for the heiress. They stepped into the stone gut, and the door bearing the mill's emblem closed behind them, cutting off the rumbling. The corridor was as quiet as a ship's hold at the bottom of the sea. Ilma stopped crying instantly and asked the little creature in a businesslike voice where the other doors led. Karan said they led home. They emerged through his wall into a living room on Ugolnaya Street, and Ilma stood there for a long time, looking at the room, which resembled her grandfather's like a reflection. Then she said that it smelled like bread here, whereas at her grandfather's it had smelled like grain. She sat down by the hearth and fell asleep mid-sentence. Karan carried her to the cot and sat beside her until dawn, thinking about what he had brought home. He had brought a child whom the capital was after. In the morning, he gathered his people. Mara took Ilma to bathe, feed, and dress her, and from that moment on, she began to follow her around like a fortress on legs. To Tobu and Osmond, Karen told them exactly what they needed to know, so they wouldn't ask questions in front of strangers. The girl was an orphan from grandfather Odvin's northern kin. She had come to live with them. The paperwork would be taken care of. The paperwork was indeed completed. By noon, Karen was standing before Duval, asking the impossible, to retroactively register the orphan Ilma as a ward at the house on Cole Street, backdated to the winter. Duval looked at him for a long time, then said that one day he would truly pay for his daughter's life, and that day had apparently arrived. He summoned the clerk, and by evening, in the church register and the city registry, Ilma had existed since winter. Duval didn't ask a single word about where the girl had come from, in a city where not a single wagon had entered in the past week. He knew how to keep quiet. And 2 days later, the Guardians returned to Grimward. There were no longer just 4 of them. Karen learned this from his boys, whom he'd long been feeding at all the city gates. 8 men, plus a 9th in command, and a traveler from the secret chancellery, at whose arrival the guards at the gates froze in their tracks. They didn't rent a house. They took over a floor of the finest inn, and that very first evening, the commander paid a visit to the city commander. Duval sent Karen a note consisting of 4 words. He asked about the girl from the north. Karen burned the note and waited for the next move. The move was made by others' hands, as was always the case with these people. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived at the settlement from City Hall. The City Guardianship Council, acting on a complaint from concerned citizens, wished to verify the conditions under which the orphan Ilma was being cared for in the home of a single young man of dubious occupation. The council was advised to place the girl in street Bridget's orphanage until the matter could be clarified. The orphanage stood by the southern gate, and its director had recently been seen leaving the inn where the capital's residents were staying. Karen read the document and saw the whole scheme as clearly as one sees a fishing line. They wanted to remove Ilma legally, quietly, and out of kindness. Children had gone missing from the orphanage before. He did not go to City Hall. He went from house to house. By evening the next day, when the Guardianship Council gathered in the town hall, the entire coal settlement and half the port had arrived. Mara stood before the council and spoke so passionately that the whitewash crumbled from the walls. She said that the whole street was raising the girl, that the orphan had 40 grandmothers and 100 uncles, and that she would personally look into the eyes of anyone who said that Mara's home was worse than the orphanage's gruel. Osmond presented the council with a document certifying that he served as the girl's physician. Duval sent an officer with a statement that the military command confirmed the household's reliability. And Reneld, who had never left because he was now inventorying the port warehouses, stood up and announced in a dry, bureaucratic voice that the property chamber saw no evidence of dubious activities in the house, as documented in its report bearing the official seal. The council adjourned after a quarter of an hour. Those who might have taken an interest did not show up at all. In the evening, the settlement was out strolling near the brewery, while Karen stood in the darkness on his doorstep, gazing at the little light in the inn's window across town. He had won a round on enemy territory, but the ninth man, who had arrived as the senior official, had not yet made a single move of his own. And that was the worst part. That night, the hall was full, and Karen worked until he was drenched in sweat. Then he sat in the hallway by the door marked with a mill sign and listened. Nothing could be heard from behind the door. Garth's house stood empty, guarded by strangers. It waited, just as the heiress, whose grandfather had been murdered, was now waiting, asleep on the other side of the wall. Karen made a vow to himself that he did not voice aloud, not even in the empty hallway. The ninth made his move a week later, and he made it in a way Karen hadn't expected. He came alone, in the afternoon, unescorted, without papers, and with no visible weapons. He knocked 3 even knocks, just as Vet had done long ago, and asked at the threshold for permission to enter, as a guest would. Karen let him in because refusal would have been an act of fear, and fear feeds such people. The guest sat down at the table and introduced himself. Moore, advisor to the secret chancellery, about 50 years old, the face of a weary teacher. He placed his hands on the table, palms up, and spoke without preamble. He said he knew about the corridor, that the chancellery had known about it for 70 years, from the interrogations of the last archivist of the burned-down department, that his predecessors had treated the caretakers harshly, and that the death of the miller Garth was a disgrace to the department, and those responsible had been stripped of their ranks. He spoke, and Karen listened without interrupting, because in the port they teach you to listen to the end. It's worth it. Moore said he had come to offer peace. The kingdom had been at war for 2 years. The roads were cut off. Convoys carrying grain and medicine bound for the army have been rotting away on the road for a month and a half. But through the Brotherhood's houses, the cargo can be delivered overnight. He offered Karen a position in the service of the crown, an official one. Overseers receive a salary, ranks, security, and the inviolability of their homes, permanently enshrined by royal decree. In exchange, the corridor operates to supply the army under the supervision of the chancellery. He said that this would save thousands of soldiers' lives, and that Karen, who had treated other people's children, could not fail to understand such arithmetic. He placed the prepared decree on the table, with a blank line for the name, and stood up. He said he would wait 3 days for a response, and that for the first time in 70 years, the chancellery was asking rather than taking, but that it did not know how to ask twice, and he left. Karen sat poring over the decree until dusk. The trap was perfect because it was the truth. The math added up. The lives were real, and the price was real. The office's records meant strangers in the hallway, strangers' locks on the doors, and in a year, a stranger's caretaker next to every house. And in 5 years, the houses would belong to the crown, with all the caretakers serving as servants. And then Karan remembered the white, smokeless fire and the 2 cities burned out from within, and he realized one more thing. Moore didn't know, or didn't want to know, the most important thing. Houses cannot be enlisted into service. Houses choose for themselves. That night, Karan went out into the hallway and did what he'd been meaning to do for a long time. He went from door to door. He knocked on each one with the knock that Vet had shown him during their second conversation. 3, 2, and 3. The door marked with the ship's symbol opened almost immediately. The caretaker was a woman in her 60s with the hands of a rope maker. Her name was Britta, and her house stood in the port city of Skeld in the west. Behind the door marked with the bridge lived Ivo, a lame scribe from the south. Behind the well lived an elderly couple. Behind the tower, silence reigned. The others opened their doors 1 or 2 at a time during the night. By the end of the third night, Karen did something that hadn't happened in 70 years of the shadows. He gathered the Brotherhood. The 8 caretakers of the living houses stood in his hallway, which had become a hub, not by chance, since the house on Cole Street was the first to be found and the oldest. Vet was the last to arrive through the tower door, and stood against the wall like a man who had waited half his life for this gathering and feared it. Karen laid everything out for them. Moore's decree, the arithmetic of war, the fate of the 2 burned down houses, and his own decision, which he'd reached while pondering the decree at twilight. He said that the corridor could not be handed over to the Chancellery, and that they could not respond with war, because a war against the crown cannot be won. That left a third option, to ensure that the crown gets its arithmetic without gaining a single door. He proposed that the Brotherhood transport the military supplies themselves, grain, medicine, and bandages, pick it up from the quartermasters at one end, and deliver it to the garrison doctors at the other, all in a single night. But the pickup and delivery must take place only outside, carried out by the overseer's own hands, without letting a single outsider inside, and without revealing a single door. To the crown, this will appear to be the work of an invisible guild of carters. We'll call the operation whatever we like, even the Night Guild. We won't accept payment in money. Our payment will be a decree granting permanent immunity to the houses and the people within them. The crown receives its supplies. The houses receive the law. The Chancellery receives nothing but the fulfillment of its need. They argued until dawn. Britta said she was old and had nothing to lose but her home, and that her home was worth it. Ivo calculated aloud the throughput capacity of the doors, and he figured that 9 houses could replace 300 carts. The old men by the well were afraid, and Karen didn't press the issue. He said that everyone decides for their own home because that's how the Brotherhood, and otherwise it would become nothing more than a small office. By morning, 7 had agreed. Vet volunteered to act as a go-between for everyone, as he always had. On the 4th day, Karen came to Moore himself at the inn, with Duval as a witness, and laid out the counter-decree, transcribed by the scribe Ivo, with every word in its proper place. Moore read it for a long time. Then he looked up, and for the first time, Karen saw in his eyes not the weariness of a teacher, but the sharp, quick mind of a gambler. Moore said that the Chancellery had been trying for 70 years to pick the lock on those doors, while the boy from the port was suggesting they use the service window instead of the doors. He said it was humiliating and brilliant, and that he would sign it because the army was starving and genius is tested by hunger. He signed both sheets, handed one to Karen, and, already at the door, turned around and added, without a trace of bureaucracy in his voice, that he was envious. Karen asked why. Moore replied that he had spent his entire life serving a building that had not chosen him, and he left. 10 days later, the royal decree returned from the capital, bearing the Great Seal. That very night, through the doors of 9 houses, the first 40 sacks and the first box of medicine passed from Karen's white compartment to the Skelde Garrison Infirmary in the time it takes for a candle to burn out. The Night Guild worked all winter, and that winter became etched in the nation's memory. Convoys got stuck in the snow, yet the garrisons ate fresh bread. The infirmaries on the southern front received medicines brewed the day before yesterday in Grimward. Quartermasters handed over cargo to silent men at secluded houses in 9 cities, and received cargo from equally silent men that same night, 300 versts away, and the accounts matched down to the last pound. The army clerks called this among themselves the miracle of the winter rout, but in their paperwork they recorded it as a special contract. Karen slept 4 hours at a time and kept track of the 9 cities in his mind, just as he had once kept track of the ship's hold. The house answered him through all its doors every night, and Karen noticed something new. The rooms had grown deeper. The warehouse now stretched 40 paces. A second workbench had been set up in the workshop. In the white compartment, a table appeared with glassware for tasks that Osmond described using words from old books. The house grew along with its burden, just as a muscle grows. And Ilma grew too. By midwinter, she was no longer a little beast. During the day, she studied letters and herbs with Osmond and outran the boys of Mara faster than they could outrun her. And at night, Karen began taking her into the hallway, because hiding his own inheritance from the heiress would have been theft. At the door marked with the mill symbol, she always stopped and placed her palm on the wood. Garth's house was silent, but beneath her palm the door's seam grew warm, and Karen saw this and remained silent as well. In the spring, what was bound to happen, according to all the laws of envy, came to pass. The guild was betrayed from within the chancery. Karen learned of this from Moore, who sent Vet with a verbal message because such matters are not trusted to paper. The old faction remained in the chancellery, those very same men stripped of their ranks for Garth's death, along with their friends. The decree of immunity had deprived them of the spoils their families had awaited for 70 years. They couldn't fight the decree, so they decided to ensure that the guild would fail to fulfill a single contract. A disrupted supply chain during wartime is treason, and treason nullifies any decree. Moore relayed that the strike should be directed at the most visible hub, and that he himself could not help, because his signature on the decree meant that his downfall was part of the price of the strike. The strike came at the start of the thaw and came from where no one was looking. In Grimward, Osmond was arrested. He was taken from his home at night on charges of poisoning. In a neighboring town, a woman in labor died after being given a medicine labeled white compartment, and the widower filed a complaint. The complaint was picked up by the right people and blown out of proportion a week before the capital's trial. The guild's medicines were ordered to be withdrawn from circulation in all 9 cities pending an investigation. With a single blow, the old faction knocked the entire shipment of medicines out of circulation and planted a time bomb under the settlement's most spotless reputation. Karen went to see the arrested Osmond, and the old man greeted him more calmly than Karen had expected. Osmond said that he knew his own medicine well, and that people didn't die from it, which meant they had died from something else, and the cause had to be found. He said this as if setting a task for a student. Karen accepted the challenge. He traveled to the town alone with the note from Duval, and spent 3 days doing what he had learned from the books in the white compartment, and from a porter's habit of not trusting labels. He questioned the midwife and the pharmacist's neighbors. He bought the remains of the vial from the widower, who had clung to it as if it were evidence. And on the 3rd day, he found what he was looking for. The vial bore the compartment's label, but the wax seal had been reapplied over the old seam, and inside, beneath the medicine, lay a sediment listed in the books under the section on kidney-affecting poisons. Someone had taken an empty guild vial and filled it with death. All that remained was to find the culprit. Karen found the culprit as well, because the town was small and people had a keen memory for strangers. A week before the new mother's death, a visitor had stopped by the apothecary's, exchanged a large coin, bought a trifle, and asked about medicines from the north. The apothecary remembered the boots, identical government-issued ones, with a horseshoe on the left heel. When Karen heard about the horseshoe, it grew quiet and cold inside him. The horseshoe had been following him all the way from Olesborough. He returned to Grimward and laid everything out for Reneld, because the case required a man whose honesty was as good as a document. Reneld pulled out his records and found in that week's inn registers the name under which one of the 4 had been staying in Olesborough. The circle was closed on paper. Duval gave the case military priority. Through Mora, to whom Vet had delivered copies, everything made its way to a desk higher up in the chancellery. The capital does not like it when its name is used to persecute new mothers. The old case was resolved within a week. Osmond was released with an apology written in such elegant prose that he ordered the sheet to be framed. The medicines were returned in full, and the horseshoe was found in the river below the capital's bridge. And when Karen learned of this, he felt nothing but weariness, because such people dispose of their own more quickly than strangers. The guild weathered the first conspiracy and emerged from it stronger, because now it had its own proven chain of inquiry and its own memory of the price of a label. But after that spring, Karen slept an hour less each night. He realized something that neither decree nor corridor could protect him from. The guild depended on him alone. If he were to die tomorrow, the 9 houses would once again become 11 orphans. And so he began to build his final project, a school. He announced to the Brotherhood through Veda that each house would take in a student, and that the students must be chosen the same way the houses are chosen, not by blood, but by the need to build a life around oneself. Britta took in her niece, Ivo took in the scribe's orphan, and Karen looked at Ilma, who at 12 could make simple ointments better than the adult apprentices, and said nothing to her. What he was going to tell her had nothing to do with apprenticeship. What he was going to do was give her back her home. And on the first night of summer, when the settlement had celebrated the harvest festival, the seam of the door bearing the mill's symbol beneath Ilma's palm didn't just grow warm, it glowed. The mill door opened to Ilma on the 14th night of summer. Karen stood behind her in the hallway, touching neither the door nor the girl. It was her threshold. Ilma entered her grandfather's house, where everything still lay overturned from that night, because the stranger's guards had long since left, and the house would not let anyone inside without the mistress. She lifted the table. She set up the cot. She swept up the grain and the shards. She did this in silence, hour after hour, while Karen sat by the threshold and guarded her grief as one guards a fire. Toward morning, she sat down in the middle of the tidied-up room and said that her grandfather had laughed in their faces, and that she now understood why. Because they had asked where the door was of a man who was himself the door. The following midnight, Garth's house opened its first room to her. It was neither a storeroom nor a workshop. It was a room with millstones and a stove. A mill within a mill. The house remembered the family craft. Ilma became the caretaker at 13, the youngest in the Brotherhood's living memory, and Olsbro got his bundle back, and the guild got the 10th house. Mara cried her heart out in the kitchen and began visiting her ward across the corridor on Wednesdays with pies, thereby breaking all the Brotherhood's customs, and no one dared to reprimand her. Thus, summer and fall passed, and as fall drew to a close, the war ended. It ended not with a victory on the battlefield, but with exhaustion and a peace treaty signed, because both sides had exhausted their last reserves. And with the peace came the most dangerous time for the guild, the very time Karen had foreseen. While the war was raging, homes were as essential to the crown as air. The decree of inviolability was based on that necessity. Now that need was fading, but the memory of the path through the walls remained. In the capital, they sat down to tally the results and share the glory. And someone was bound to ask why private citizens should own the grain that had been transported through the winter to feed the army. The question came in the spring, and it came in the harshest form possible. Not as an order, but as an invitation. The young king, having restored the roads, was touring the country, and Grimward was on his list of stops. On the list of people to be introduced, first after the commandant was Karen, the foreman of the Night Guild from Cole Street. Moore sent a message via vet without a written note. He relayed that there were 2 factions at court. One proposed that the king buy the houses for the treasury for any price. The other proposed declaring them military property retroactively and paying nothing at all, and that the king was young and intelligent and had not yet decided, and that he would decide by looking into Karen's eyes rather than by reading papers, because that was the kind of king he was. The town had been preparing for the king's arrival for 2 weeks, and Karen had been preparing for a single conversation. He wasn't preparing speeches. He was preparing what he could do better than words. He was preparing a display. The king entered Grimward in early May, and the city was buzzing. On the 3rd day of his visit, the king dismissed his entourage, except for 2 bodyguards and more, and walked down Cole Street, just as Duval had once walked to Osmond. He was 24 years old. He looked out over the settlement without a smile, and saw everything. The grocery store with its prices, Osmond's medical school for 12 students, Mara's boiled house, where they fed him without asking who he was, because Mara, as a matter of principle, never recognized anyone richer than a miller. Then he entered the gray windowless house, sat down by the hearth, and said he was listening. Karen didn't talk about the rooms. He talked about the people. He listed the numbers from the winter contract and wrote a name next to each one. That many sacks belong to the overseer Britta, who is 61 years old and has palms torn by ropes. That many boxes of medicine belong to the girl Ilma, whose grandfather was killed by the crown and who still hauled serum for the crown all winter long. He said that the houses cannot be bought because they are not for sale. They can only be taken by force, as 2 were, and that the treasury will receive 1 stone coffins. He said you couldn't take them home because they choose for themselves, and they don't choose the strong, but those who build. And then he made his final move, which he'd been mulling over for 2 weeks. He offered the king something no one else had offered. He offered the crown, the 11th house. The house bearing the symbol of the burning tower had stood abandoned for 70 years in the burned-out city of Astali, which had never been rebuilt. Karen said that the Brotherhood would give the crown not doors, but knowledge. How to live alongside such a house. How not to drain it of its life force. How to rebuild a city around it. And if the house one day chose someone from among the king's people to be its caretaker, that caretaker would join the Brotherhood as an equal, and the crown would gain its window into this world fairly, through choice, not through force. He said it might take a year, or it might take 20 years, and that the house owes nothing to anyone. The room fell silent. Moore stared at the floor, and Karen could see that the advisor had heard the underlying meaning in the proposal. Karen wasn't giving the crown a house. Karen was giving the crown hope and turning the hunter into a seeker. He who waits for a choice does not burn him who chooses. The king was silent for a long time. Then he asked, not about the house. He asked why Karen himself, in all that time, had taken neither rank nor money, even though he could have asked for anything. Karen answered truthfully, because nothing else worked with this king. He said he had seen people who drained their gift dry and had seen what became of their cities. He said that a gift responds in kind to what it is fed. Feed it with greed and you get ashes. Feed it with action and you get a road. The king stood up and said that he would confirm the decree of immunity indefinitely with his own hand, and that he accepted the 11th house on the terms of brotherhood. At the door, he paused and added that in the capital, he had been taught that everything in the kingdom belonged to the crown. He said that today, for the first time, he had seen something that belonged only to itself, and that this sight had been worth the trip. When the footsteps faded, Moore was the last to linger on the threshold. He said that old Odwin had hidden the door for 40 years, while the boy, in just 2 years, had made it so that the door now hid all of them. He asked if Karen knew what Cole Street was now called in the Chancery. Karen did not know. Moore said that it was called Castle Street, not from the word castle, meaning a fortress, but from the word lock, as in a door lock, and he left to catch up with the king. 3 years passed. Grimward rebuilt the port and forgot the price of flour at 20 skilling, and both visitors and locals now called Cole Street Castle Street, and few remembered why. The settlement had grown into a neighborhood. Osmond's medical school was turning out doctors for half the country, and the old man kept threatening to die peacefully. Yet every year he took on new students. Tob ran the instrument shops, and his grandchildren were considered faster than he was. Mara had grown old in speech, but not in anything else, and on Wednesdays she delivered pies to 3 houses already, because there were more students in the hallway. The guild went about its daily business. Now they transported not military cargo, but medicine to areas hit by plagues, grain to regions suffering from crop failures, and books for new schools, because Evo had gotten his way and filled the hallway with books. A dozen students were studying at home, and 2 of them could already hear their homes as clearly as the caretaker could. At 16, Ilma ran the mill with a firm hand, and half of Olsbro worked for her as apprentices. And in Estelle, amid the rebuilt streets, stood a house bearing the sign of a burning tower, silent. The king's people had lived humbly by his side for 3 years now, sweeping his threshold and not venturing inside, and the king kept every word he had given. Karen was 23 years old, and he found himself increasingly aware that the house had become an extension of his hands and the corridor a map of his memory, and that he was happy with that quiet happiness that doesn't shout. That fall, Vet died. He died as he had lived, on the road between doors, quietly in his sleep on a bench at Britta's. The Brotherhood buried him in Skeld with its full membership, and Karen stood over the grave of the man who had once left a coin on his doorstep, thinking that his whole life had begun with 3 polite knocks on the door. After the funeral, all the caretakers gathered in the hallway of his house, and Karen told them what he had decided long ago. He said that the Brotherhood could no longer be held together by a single node and a single elder. He proposed a council of houses where every guardian was equal, and a rotation of messengers from among the apprentices so that the way of Veta would not be left empty. The proposal was accepted unanimously, and that evening, for the first time in years, Karen felt he could breathe deeply. The guild would no longer die with him. And in the winter, the house posed its final question to him. On the night of the solstice, Karen woke up to find a light burning in the living quarters, not under the doors, just a light, steady and warm, like on that first night in the warehouse. All 3 doors stood open, and the 4th one in the back wall was open as well, but the corridor beyond it looked different. At the end of the hallway, where there had always been a blank wall, there was now a 12th door. No sign, brand new. The light-colored wood still smelled of shavings. Karen approached and realized that the house wasn't showing him something foreign. The house was asking a question. Behind the door without a sign, there was no room and no city. Beyond it lay the place where houses are born, or from which they come. And for the first time in all the ages, the house was inviting the caretaker to look inside. Karen stood before the door for a very long time. He thought of Ilma, of the settlement, of the council of houses, of everything that had been built and now stood without him. He could go in. He had earned the answer to the question he had never once asked aloud. What are you? He reached out and placed his palm on the light-colored wood. The wood was as warm as a shoulder, and Karen smiled and withdrew his hand. He said aloud to the house what he had come to understand over the years with his laborer's mind, more clearly than any book could explain. He said that there are doors that aren't opened to let someone in. They're opened to show trust. He said he didn't need an answer because he already knew what mattered most. Homes go where they're going to be built. Everything else is curiosity, and curiosity doesn't put food on the table. He said he'd stay on this side because his people were on this side. The light in the room grew brighter for a moment, as if the house had exhaled. The 12th door closed and dissolved into the stone, and Karen knew that it hadn't disappeared, but would simply wait, perhaps for his old age, or for his student's student. The house has nowhere to hurry. In the spring, a letter arrived from Estelle, written in hasty, boyish handwriting, and sealed with the commandant's seal. The 12-year-old son of a local stonemason, the very same boy who had carried water to the house for 3 years and talked to its walls in the evenings, woke up to the click of the lock and the light under the door. The house of the burning tower had chosen him. The first house had returned from the dead, and it had chosen not a courtier nor an officer, but a child who had been building his own little life right next to it, just like that. Karen was reading the letter in the middle of the storeroom and laughing, and Mara snatched the letter away, read it, and burst into tears loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. That summer, Karen walked down the corridor to Estelle himself and met the new caretaker. The boy looked at him as if he were a character from a storybook, and Karen remembered himself standing in the rain before the gray walls with a leaven skilling in his pocket. He didn't give the boy a long speech. He gave him a beechwood spoon, the very first one, carved on the very second night, rough and honest, which he had kept all these years by the hearth next to the cracked coin. He said it was the caretaker's most important tool. The boy asked why a spoon. Karen replied that the house provides the flour, but it is hands that turn it into bread, and that the whole secret of their service lies in that difference. In the fall, at the Council of Houses, 11 caretakers and 1 foreman, whom they stubbornly re-elected every year, no matter how much he refused, they adopted their first common charter, consisting of a single line proposed by Ilma. The line stated that a caretaker serves neither the house nor the crown, but that which grows around the house. Karen was the last to return from the council. He blew out the candle in the hallway and, out of habit, touched each door with his palm as he passed. 11 warm doors. The houses stood in 11 cities. By day they seemed like useless boxes, but at night lights burned within them, and people studied, worked, healed, and built. He went into his room, lay down on the cot, which he had never replaced with a better one, and listened to his impossible house breathing behind the wall. 3 years ago, in the rain, a notary read him his inheritance, a stone sack and a copper key, and the crowd laughed. The inheritance turned out not to be a house. The inheritance turned out to be a post, and the post became a cause, and the cause became life for thousands of people whom he now knew by name. Karen drifted off to sleep, and even through his slumber, heard the familiar click of the lock at midnight, and saw a warm streak of light through his eyelids. The house was opening its doors to him, just like every night, just like always. The mill's door opened for Ilmi on the 14th night of summer. Karen stood behind her in the hallway and touched neither the door nor the girl. It was her threshold and her right. The streak of light beneath the mill's sign flared up evenly and brightly beneath the child's palm, and the door slid inward without a creak, as if it had been oiled during all those months of waiting. Ilma entered her grandfather's house, where everything still lay turned upside down from that night, because the outside guards had long since left Olsbro, and the house would not let anyone inside without the mistress. The locks would not yield to lockpicks. Crowbars slipped off. The office staff struggled for a week and left, drafting a report stating that the house could not be forced open. A report that Moore later showed to Karen with a wry smirk. Ilma lifted the table. She put the cot back in its place. She gathered the shards into the hem of her skirt and carried them out. She swept up the scattered grain, handful by handful, without throwing a single grain away. She did this in silence, hour after hour, and Karen sat by the threshold, guarding her grief as one guards a fire, neither extinguishing it nor fanning it. When she reached a dark spot on the wall at shoulder height, she stopped and stood there for a long time. Then she brought some water and washed the stone herself without letting Karen near it. Toward morning, she sat down in the middle of the tidied-up room and said that her grandfather had laughed in their faces and that she now understood why. Because they had asked where the door was of a man who was himself the door. Karen remembered those words forever. The following midnight, Garth's house opened its first room to her. It was neither a storeroom, nor a workshop, nor a hall. It was a room with small millstones, a bread oven, and chests. A mill within a mill. The house remembered the family craft and began a conversation with the heiress in the language she had known since birth. That night, Ilma baked bread and carried it out to Olsbro Square in the morning, silently handing it out to the neighbors. The town, which had been whispering for half a year about the cursed mill, ate Garth's granddaughter's warm bread, and the whispering ceased. And so, at the age of 13, she became the caretaker, the youngest in the Brotherhood's living memory, and Olsbro regained its knot, while the guild reclaimed the 10th house. Britta sent her a rope belt via a messenger. Evo sent a primer and a herbarium. Mara cried her heart out in the stewing pot and began visiting her ward across the corridor on Wednesdays with pies, thereby breaking all the unwritten customs of the Brotherhood, and no one dared to reprimand her because Mara would raise an eyebrow in response to any rule. Summer and fall passed in this way, and as fall drew to a close, the war ended. It ended not with a victory on the battlefield, but through exhaustion and a peace treaty signed because both sides had exhausted their last reserves. The bells rang for 3 days. The port of Grimward opened fully, and for the first time in years, the city lived without lines. And with this peace, the most dangerous time for the guild began, one that Quran had foreseen back in the winter. While the war was raging, homes were as essential to the crown as air. The decree of inviolability was held up by this need like a bridge on oxen. Now that the need was fading, the memory of the route through the walls remained. In the capital, they were sitting down to tally the results of the war and divide the glory and the money. And someone was bound to ask aloud why private individuals should own what had carried bread for an entire army through the winter. Quran had spoken of this at the Brotherhood Council, even before the first bells rang. Evo had then objected that the decree had been signed indefinitely. Quran replied that a piece of paper is only as strong as the hand behind it, and hands in the capital come and go. The question arose in the spring, and it came in the harshest form possible, not as an order that could be contested, nor as an inspection that could be endured, an invitation. The young king, having restored the roads, was touring the country, and Grimward was on his list of stops. And on the list of those to be personally presented to him, first after the commandant, was Quran, the senior officer of the Night Guild from Cole Street. Moore sent a message to Vet without paper, because such paper is not trusted. He reported that 2 factions had formed at court. The first, led by the treasurer, proposes that the king buy the houses for the treasury at any price, and has already calculated the cost. The second, consisting of military officials, proposes declaring the houses military property retroactively under the right to supply the army, and not paying anything at all. Both factions agree on one thing: such power must not be left unchecked, and that the king is young and wise, and listened to both sides but did not decide, and that he will decide by looking at Karen with his own eyes rather than by reading papers, because that is the kind of king he is. He trusts people more than reports, and has already benefited from this twice. The settlement had been preparing for the king's arrival for 2 weeks. They washed the cobblestones. Tob forged new hinges for the storeroom gate. Osmond lined up his students and rehearsed a bow with them until Mara pointed out that doctors should bow to their patients. And Karen was preparing for a single conversation, and he was preparing in a way no one expected. He didn't write speeches. He didn't prepare gifts. Duval cautiously suggested he at least get a new caftan, and Curran bought one so as not to offend the commandant. But his mind was elsewhere. He was planning the conversation just as he had planned his first conversation with Reneld, drop by drop of truth. Only now, the drops were meant to come together not as a defense, but as an offer that could not be refused without losing even more. The king entered Grimward in early May, and the city was abuzz. For 3 days there were parades, receptions, and dinners, and Karen stood in the general ranks and was introduced among the others, and the king's gaze swept over him without lingering, and Karen realized that this, too, was a move. The king had been watching him surreptitiously all 3 days. On the 4th day of the visit, the king dismissed his entourage, except for 2 bodyguards and Mora, and walked down Cole Street just as Duval had once walked to Osmond's house. He was 24 years old, tall and stooped, with the watchful eyes of a man who had learned to distrust others at an early age. He walked slowly through the settlement, observing everything without a smile, taking it all in. The grocery store, with its fair prices written in chalk on a board. The medical school for 12 students, where no one jumped to their feet at his arrival because Osmond was in the middle of demonstrating a bandage, and one doesn't interrupt a bandage demonstration. The Murr family's inn, where the king was served pea soup without being asked who he was, because Mara, as a matter of principle, never recognized anyone richer than a miller by sight, and the king ate 2 bowls. Then he entered a gray, windowless house, ducking under the lintel, sat down on a simple bench by the hearth, looked around at the bare walls and the 3 doors, and said he was listening. Karen didn't bother to describe the rooms. The king already knew everything there was to know about the rooms from his reports. Karen spoke about the people. He recited the numbers from the winter contract by heart and paired each number with a name. So many thousand sacks. That's the overseer Britta, who is 61 years old, whose palms have been torn by ropes over 40 years in the port, and who hasn't missed a single night all winter. So many crates of medicine belonged to a girl named Ilma, whose grandfather had been killed by the Crown's men, and who still delivered serum to the Crown's garrisons all winter long, because her grandfather had died laughing, not cursing. So many wounded brought in alive were the old men from the well, who feared everything in the world, and yet opened their door every night. The king listened without interrupting, and Moore, standing by the wall, did not lift his eyes from the floor. Then Karen moved on to the second part. He said he knew of 2 factions at court, and was now speaking out against both. Houses cannot be bought, because they are not for sale. You can sell the walls, but the house will vanish from within them, just as life vanished from those 2 houses 70 years ago, and the treasury will receive, for any price, 11 stone coffins, and he is ready to show the king reports on the fires that have burned cities from within, if such reports have not yet been shown to the king. Houses cannot be seized under martial law either, because people choose their own homes. Take the walls, and in a year, the crown will have 11 dead boxes, while new houses will begin to spring up across the country among new people, and the crown will chase after them forever, just as the secret chancellery chased them for 70 years, spending 3 generations of its finest people on the task, and gaining not a single door. He fell silent, giving the king time to ask a question. The king asked exactly what a wise man should ask. He asked what, then, should be done with them, because neither the treasurer nor the marshal nor his own common sense would allow him to leave things as they were. Unchecked power has no place in a state. And then Karen made his final move, one he'd been mulling over for 2 weeks, and which he hadn't even fully revealed to the Brotherhood beforehand. He offered the king something that no one had ever offered before. He offered the crown, the 11th house. The house bearing the emblem of the burning tower had stood abandoned for 70 years in the burned-out town of Estelle, which had never been rebuilt because people feared the ruins. Karen said that the Brotherhood would not give the crown the doors. The doors do not even belong to the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood would give the crown knowledge, everything the keepers had gathered over 70 years about how to live alongside such a house, how to rebuild a living city around a dead house, how not to strain oneself, how to wait. And if the house one day comes to life and chooses one of the king's people as its guardian, then that guardian will enter the Brotherhood as as an equal among equals, and the crown will receive its window into this world fairly, through choice, not by force. He said that this might take a year, or it might take 20 years, and that no one is promising anything because the houses owe nothing to anyone. But for the crown, for the first time in 70 years, there will be not an enemy behind a solid wall, but a path to its own door. The room grew very quiet. The bodyguards at the entrance didn't understand half of it, but they sensed the weight of the silence. Moore stared at the floor, and Karen could tell from his clenched fingers that the advisor had heard a second meaning in the proposal, one that Karen hadn't spoken aloud. Karen was not giving the crown a home. Karen was giving the crown hope, and in doing so, he was transforming the hunter into a suitor. He who waits for a choice does not pressure the one who chooses. He who dreams of joining the Brotherhood will not stifle it. With a single sentence, both court factions were deprived of their point of contention, and the crown received what it had been unable to obtain by force for 3 generations. The king was silent for a long time. He stood up, walked across the room, touched the cold stone of the niche with his finger, and stood by the third door with his back to everyone. Then he turned around and asked, not about houses. He asked why Karen himself, in all that time, had accepted any rank, land, or money, even though he could have asked the crown for anything and would have received it. The treasurer had reported to him that the guild elder had not taken a single skilling above the prescribed amount for the winter contract, and the treasurer had not believed it and had checked 3 times. Karen answered truthfully, because he sensed that nothing else would work with this king, and that the entire conversation had been leading up to this question. He said that, according to the Brotherhood's records, he had seen people who had drained their gift dry, and he had seen what became of their homes and their cities. He said that the gift responds in kind to what it is fed. Feed it with greed, and you get ashes. Feed it with fear, and you get silence. Feed it with action, and you get a path. He said that he was a porter and measured everything by its weight. Rank and gold are burdens placed upon a person from above, but action is a burden a person carries from within, and one that makes them stronger. He chose the second because there was no room in his house for the first. The king smiled for the first time that day. The smile was brief and genuine. He said he would ratify the decree of immunity indefinitely with his own hand and his great seal, and enter it into the crown book, from which decrees are never removed. He said he would accept the 11th house on the terms of brotherhood, and would send not soldiers, but builders to Estelle, and that his first order would be to rebuild the area around the dead house. Because if the houses are choosing their builders, then it is time for the crown to start building. At the door, he paused, gripping the doorframe, and added in a voice younger than his years that in the capital he had been taught since childhood that everything in the kingdom belongs to the crown. The land, the water, the people, and the stones. He said that today, for the first time, he had seen something that belonged only to itself and to no one else, and that this sight alone was worth the entire journey. And he stepped out, ducking under the lintel. When the footsteps and the clatter of horseshoes had died down, Moore was the last to linger on the threshold. He stood there, gazing at Karen with the lingering look of a man who had lost a game but gained peace. He said that old Odwin had hidden a single door for 40 years, while a boy from the port had managed in just 2 years to make it so that now the door hides all of them, along with the crown. He asked if Karen knew what they now call Cole Street among themselves in the Chancery. Karen didn't know. Moore said it was called Castle Street, and the young clerks thought it came from the word castle, meaning a fortress, while the older ones knew it came from the word lock, the kind that hangs on a door and which no one has ever managed to open. He saluted in military fashion, though he had never been in the military, and left to catch up with the king. That evening, the town celebrated until midnight, and at midnight, Karen stood alone in the hallway before the door bearing a burned-in cross over the symbol of the burning tower, thinking that soon these planks could be removed. 3 years had passed. Grimward rebuilt the port, expanded the docks, and forgot the price of flour at 20 skilling. Coal Street was now called Castle Street by both visitors and locals alike, and few of the young people remembered why. The settlement had grown into a neighborhood with its own well, bathhouses, and 2 rows of shops. Osmond's medical school was turning out doctors for half the country, and though they were looked down upon at the capital's university, the graduates were snapped up because Osmond's students treated patients rather than merely theorizing. The old man himself kept threatening to die peacefully, as he had once promised in the White Chamber, but every fall he took on new students, and every spring he said these would be his last. Tob managed the supply rooms and had all but stepped away from the business because his grandchildren could calculate faster than he could and haggle more fiercely. Mara had grown old in speech, but not in anything else, and on Wednesdays she delivered pies to 3 houses already because there were more students in the hallway, and according to her firm conviction, a growing person, no matter their talent, must eat a hot meal. The guild lived through its daily routines, and these routines changed the country more quietly than any war. They were no longer transporting military cargo. They were transporting medicine to cities where plagues were breaking out, and the outbreaks began to die down within weeks rather than seasons. They were transporting grain to the famine-stricken corners of the kingdom, and the word famine began to fade from conversation into the realm of fairy tales. They transported books because Evo had gotten his way at the Third Council and had cluttered the hallway with crates of primers for the new schools, grumbling that education weighed more than grain. A dozen students were studying in their homes, and 2 of them had already come to hear their homes the way a caretaker does. At night, in 11 cities behind thick walls, lights burned, and people ground, pounded, planed, cooked, and studied. And at dawn, they carried what they had made out into the world. At 16, Ilma ran the mill with a firm hand, and half of Olsbro worked for her as apprentices, while the town elders came to the girl for advice, and saw nothing strange in this, for over the course of 3 years they had grown accustomed to it, just as one grows accustomed to the sun. And in Estelle, amid the new streets that the king had rebuilt as promised, stood a house bearing the sign of a burning tower, silent. The king's people had been living humbly under his rule for 3 years now. They swept his threshold. They repaired the roof tiles without stepping inside. They laid out a garden nearby. The king kept every word he gave and never once asked about deadlines. And Karen valued that silence more highly than any decree. Karen was 23 years old, and he increasingly found himself realizing that the house had become an extension of his hands, and the hallway a map of his memory, and that he was happy with that quiet happiness that doesn't shout about itself, but simply stands nearby like a warm wall. Sometimes, out of old habit, he would wake in the middle of the night in a cold sweat at the thought that it was all a dream, that dawn would break soon, revealing a bare floor and the vanished sacks. Then he would place his palm on the stone, and the stone was warm. That fall, Vet died. He died as he had lived, on the road between doors, quietly in his sleep, on a bench at Britta's and Shelda, with an unfinished mug on the table and a travel bag packed for tomorrow. The Brotherhood buried him in full force, and it was the first funeral in the Brotherhood's entire history to which the caretakers came openly, all together. 11 people gathered at a single grave by the sea. Standing by the coffin, Britta said that for 40 years, Vet had carried not letters, but trust between homes, and that now everyone would have to carry that trust in turn. Karen stood by the grave of the man who had once left a coin on his doorstep, thinking that his entire present life had begun with 3 polite knocks on the door, and that he had never learned Vet's real name, and that it was for the best. A traveler must leave more lightly than he came. After the funeral, all the caretakers gathered in the hallway of the house on Zamkovia Street, and Karen told them what he had decided long ago and had been carrying within him since the spring of the conspiracy. He said that the Brotherhood could no longer rely on a single node and a single elder. That he was mortal, just like Vet and like Hart, and that the path must not die along with a man. He proposed a council of houses where every guardian is equal and decisions are made by majority vote. A rotation of senior students to serve as pathkeepers so that Vet's trail would not become overgrown. And a common guild treasury, not for wealth, but for a rainy day for any of the houses. The debate did not last long. Ivo proposed writing the council's decisions in a common book and keeping it not in a single house, but transcribing it into 11 copies. Ilma, the youngest at the table, added that, in time, students with a vote should also be included in the council, because the road ahead is longer than that of anyone sitting here. Everything was accepted. That evening, Karen was the last to walk down the corridor, extinguishing the candles, and for the first time in years, he felt he could breathe deeply. The guild would no longer die with him. The cause had broken free from any one person and stood on its own 2 feet, just as a completed ship takes to the water. And that winter, the house posed one final question to him. On the night of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Karen woke up to find the light on in the living room. It wasn't a sliver of light under the door, just an even, warm light coming from everywhere and nowhere, just like on that first night in the warehouse more than 3 years ago. All 3 doors stood wide open. The 4th door in the back wall was open as well, but the hallway beyond it looked different than usual. It was longer. At its far end, where there had always been a blank wall at the end of the row of 11 doors, there was now a 12th door. No sign. Brand new. The light-colored wood still smelled of shavings, just as fresh work in a workshop does. Karen walked toward it, past the 11 familiar doors, and each one felt warm beneath his palm. And he understood without words, just as he now understood so much in his home. The house does not show him what is foreign. The house asks. Behind the door without a sign, there was no room, no city, and nothing that could be named with words made for things. Behind it lay the place from which homes come, where they are born, or wait, or choose, the source of the road. And for the first time in all its centuries, the house invited the caretaker to look inside, not as a reward, out of trust. Karen stood before the door for a very long time. The candle in his hand had burned down to his fingertips, and he set the stub on the floor and stood in the warm light of the house. He thought of Ilma, who was waiting for him at the council tomorrow, about the settlement that would open its shops in the morning, about the boy in Estelle, about the council of houses, about the book on the 11 lists, about everything that had been built and now stood firm without him, but better with him. He could go inside. He deserved an answer to the question he had never once asked aloud in all those years, not even to an empty hallway. Who are you? Where are you from? Why did you choose us? He reached out and placed his palm on the light-colored wood. The wood was as warm as a friend's shoulder, and Karen smiled and withdrew his hand. He said aloud to the house what he had come to understand over the years with his laborer's mind more clearly than any book in the white compartment. He said that there are doors that are opened not so that people may enter them. They are opened to show trust. And trust is answered, not with curiosity, but with trust. He said he didn't need an answer because he already knew what mattered most. Homes go where they will be built. Everything else is curiosity. And curiosity doesn't put food on the table. Worse yet, it once devoured 2 cities. He said he was staying on this side because on this side were his people, his council, his neighborhood, and his unfinished work. And he had never abandoned unfinished work once since he'd been hauling sacks at the port. The light in the house grew brighter for a moment, as if the house had exhaled, or smiled, if houses can. The 12th door closed softly, without a sound, and dissolved into the stone, leaving no seam. And Karan knew for certain, just as he now knew everything about his house, that she hadn't disappeared. She would wait, perhaps until his old age when the work is finished, or for his student's student. The house has nowhere to hurry to. The road has no end. There are only keepers. In the spring, a letter arrived from Estelle, written in quick, boyish handwriting, with a blot on the fold and certified by the seal of the local commandant, who clearly didn't know how to certify such a thing. The son of a mason, 12 years old, the very same one who for 3 years had carried water to the house just because, and talked to its walls in the evenings, because at first he had no friends on his new street, woke up on the night of the equinox to the click of a lock and a warm light under the door. The house of the burning tower, which had stood dead for 73 years, chose him. And it chose not a courtier, not an officer, and not a scholar sent by the crown, but a child who was building his own little life right next to it, asking for nothing in return. Karen read the letter in the middle of the storeroom and laughed out loud, unable to stop. Mara took the letter, read it syllable by syllable, and wailed loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. For half a day afterward, she told every customer that she had always known it would be this way. Upon learning of this, the king sent not a governor, but teachers to Estelle, along with a congratulatory message to the Brotherhood, written in his own hand. They say Moore read this message aloud in the chancellery twice. That summer, Karen himself walked down the corridor to Estelle, through the door from which the council had solemnly removed the blackened boards, and met the new caretaker. The boy's name was Pierce, and he looked at the guild elder as if he were a character from a book, stuttering with nervous excitement. Karen remembered himself standing in the rain before the gray walls, with 11 skilling in his pocket and a sentence of the marshes hanging over his head. He didn't give the boy a speech. Speeches are no good for days like this. He gave him a beechwood spoon, the very first one he'd carved on his second night, rough, slightly crooked, and honest, which he'd kept all these years in a hiding place behind the hearth, next to a cracked silver coin. Pierce twirled the spoon in his hands and asked, "Why a spoon?" Karen replied that the house provides the flour, but it is the hands that make the bread, and that the entire secret of their service lies entirely in this distinction, and that when Pierce truly understood this, he would carve his own spoon and pass it on. In the fall, at the Grand Council of Houses in the corridor at Zamkovaya, 12 overseers gathered, along with the elder, who was stubbornly re-elected every year, no matter how much he refused. 12 houses, for the first time in history. The council adopted the Brotherhood's first general charter, and the charter fit into a single line proposed by Ilma, which Ivo solemnly inscribed in the book 11 times with his own hand, while Pierce began the 12th entry. The line stated that a steward serves neither the house nor the crown, but that which grows around the house. Karen was the last to return from the council. He blew out the candles in the hallway, and, out of old habit, touched each door with his palm as he passed by. 12 warm doors. The tower, the mill, the ship, the bridge, the well, and others. The houses stood in 12 cities across the country, and by day they seemed to passers-by like useless, empty boxes. But at night, lights burned within them, and people ground, studied, healed, planed, and built. And in the morning, they carried what they had made out into the world, and the world became a little bit more satisfied, wiser, and kinder every day. He stepped out of the hallway into his room. He lay down on the cot, which he had never replaced with a better one, even though Tob had offered 3 times. He listened to his impossible house breathing evenly behind the wall. A little over 3 years ago, in the rain, a notary read him his inheritance, a stone sack with no windows and a copper key, while the crowd at the gate laughed and a dealer offered 200 shillings out of pity. The inheritance turned out not to be a house. The inheritance turned out to be a post. The post became a mission. The mission became a road, and the road became life for thousands of people whom he now knew by name, people who didn't know even half the truth about the gray house, yet were well-fed, healthy, and occupied with the here and now. That was how it was meant to be. Karen no longer asked who had planned it. He fell asleep, and even through his sleep, at midnight, he heard the familiar soft click of the lock and saw, through his closed eyelids, a warm streak of light stretch across the room. The house was opening its doors to him, just like every night, just like always.